don't think anyone can sit here, really. Yeah, we're done. Good morning, all, and welcome to the TAC Education Program. We've been running this program for a couple of years now, and they've proven to be really, really successful. This morning's session is part 3A of a 3-part series on assessment, and we have found that this year assessment has been a really huge topic for our client group, which are the RTOs, the trainers, and the assessors. We've been running this program, I think this TAC education program, for well over 2 years now, and have received a great deal of feedback. At the end of this session, we'll be inviting you to provide us a bit of feedback about how we're going, what are the topics you'd like to see us deliver for you next year. I'd like to introduce Dr. Russell Docking, whom many of you probably know. Like me, he's been in the system for a while, working on training and assessment issues. Russell is going to be the facilitator for this morning's session. If you need to go to the bathrooms, just go out the door. For gents, it's straight ahead of you. For ladies, you need to go out the electronic doors, and it's immediately to your right. This morning, we do have quite a few people online joining us through a webinar, so I'd like to welcome them as well. I'll hand over to Russell now to start the session.
Thank you very much, Poku. It's really good to be here and to see so many familiar faces and to see some new faces that I haven't seen before, but those are the ones that are still smiling. It is really nice to see you and to welcome you to this session. As Poku indicated, this is the third of 3 sessions, but we've expanded it to make it 4 sessions now because in November we'll be looking at some other topics, particularly validation of assessments, which relates to standards 1.9 through 111, and looking at complaints and appeals, particularly appeals, which relates to standard 6 of the standards for RTOs. And so session 3, which was going to try and cover all 5 topics, will now be delivered in 2 parts. So today we're going to be looking at using assessment tools. And in previous sessions, the first session looked at designing an assessment system. The second session looked at designing assessment tools. And this one now looks at using those assessment tools, making the assessment decision, also thought of as the judgment process, and keeping assessment records. So these 3 topics plus the next 2 topics in the next series of workshops will be finishing off, rounding out, if you like, the whole area of assessment within the vet sector. As part of the materials for today, you have a package of resources. You have an abbreviated version of the PowerPoint presentation, which provides you with an opportunity to take some notes. You will also find a unit of competency, contribute to assessment, and its assessment requirements. That's there because we're going to be using it during some activities that we have planned for our session this morning. So it just saves us handing it out later on, but it's not specifically related to today's topic, even though, of course, there's some synergies between contributing to assessment and the assessment issue overall. You'll also find a TAC fact sheet on assessment. This has been recently revised, but what we'll be doing today is entirely consistent with what's in the fact sheet, and will reinforce many of the ideas within the fact sheet itself. There is also a fact sheet on assessment validation, and although that really is a topic for next time, there are some aspects of our discussions today which will relate to validation, so it's there for your information. There is a training accreditation guideline on records management. You'll find that is a bit dated. I think it's actually dated, literally dated 2015. So it is a little bit out of date. It's the one that's currently on the website. it possibly needs a little bit of revision. For example, it makes reference to client qualification register, which is no longer in use within TAC. Now everything is done through the AVITMIS and USI reporting, which serves that function. But there are other aspects within this document which are really very relevant, and we'll be dealing with that later on when we're looking at keeping assessment records. And then there is a document called RTI Reporting Requirements. And although, strictly speaking, reporting qualifications is not part of assessment, it is the natural consequence of assessment. So we will be looking at, when we're looking at keeping assessment records, we'll be also reflecting on your RTO reporting responsibilities, particularly in this case, your AVITMIS and USI reporting. That does have a bearing on some of the requirements of the standards, particularly Standard 3, of the when it relates to issuance of qualifications, which, as I said before, is a consequence of your assessment process. So this is our theme for today, and I'm here as your facilitator. I've facilitated the other 3 workshops. And there is a coherent theme between all of the workshops, but given the fact that many of you today here in this room and also online are new to this series, we will do a very brief recap of many of the issues and ideas that were addressed earlier, partly because of the fact that you're new to this series, but also because it also provides us with a common foundation for the discussion of our topics of using assessment tools, making assessment judgments, and keeping assessment records. My background is that I'm an auditor. I usually like to stand near the door when I mention that so I can make a quick getaway. But as an auditor, I have the enormous privilege of meeting with you and other RTOs, seeing what you do. I learn a great deal from what people do. There are some tremendously innovative and inventive things being done by RTOs in the areas of assessment. But I also, unfortunately, see things that need a little bit of attention, a little bit of adjustment. So I can bring to these workshops obviously in a general way, the sorts of observations that we see as auditors within the context of assessment. So it's as Poku has said, I've been working in the game for a while. It's probably 30 years, but I'm continue to be excited by the fact that RTOs are making real progress in the way in which they do things. Every now and then you do observe criticism within the press and the media generally about the vet sector. It's not usually relating to things like assessment, it's usually relating to things like funding and fees. But nonetheless, there is occasionally some dissenting voice about the approach we're taking, obviously competency-based approach to training, delivery and assessment. And part of the problem, I think, is that those dissenting voices are people that weren't around, as I was, before these systems were in place. And indeed, one of the activities we're going to look at today provides a review of what was happening in 1986, I think, when I did a review of apprenticeship training in Western Australia. In many ways, that review led to a rethink about how training should be managed within the vet sector. And in working with the then Department of Training, of Employment and Training, we set about to build competency standards across the trades. That sort of has channeled on from there to where we are now. I then did another paper in 2001 saying, well, has anything changed? And a little bit scarily, things hadn't changed significantly from the old days to that time. And I'm taking the opportunity with our activity today to ask the question, are things better now? And I would really like to find that they were, because it would tell us that our education programs were working. But just as an observer, as an auditor, I am certainly seeing fewer and fewer significant issues in assessment within RTOs. And that is really, really encouraging. So it's really good to see you here today because you represent those people who are giving thought to your own professional development and to analyse your own practices and to share with each other some really good ideas on how we can keep our assessment systems running effectively and providing us with quality judgments and outcomes. So what I like to do at this point is to ask, well, why are you here? Some people will say, well, I found my way and sat-nav got me here. But apart from that, what do you want to get from today? What is it that you're looking for today? And I'd particularly be interested in hearing from people who haven't been to this series before. And that also might be people who are observing online. Might like to share.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll rush there with the mic.
Anyone like to share an observation? What do you think I mean, you're here because you feel there's a need. What is the need? What worries you about assessment at the moment that says that you need to be at a workshop like today? Yes.
I'll have a go.
Good on you, mate.
At least to break the ice.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Grant Hunt from Yachting, Western Australia. The main reason why I come to these particular seminars is to ensure that I am meeting the requirements. I think we need to keep on top of what we actually have to do. It maintains our professional development process. It also ensures that we are meeting the requirements within the standards so that we don't get picked up like auditors. Thank you.
So there are the standards, of course. You're familiar with the standards, and those of you who would need to be refer to the July 2017 standards. So they've about a bit over a year ago they were updated, and we'll refer to that fact a little bit on the way through. The standards may be seen as a kind of shadowy, dangerous a threat to you, but in actual fact what they do is provide a basis for quality judgments, and they actually provide you with a lot of protection. The judgments that we're going to look at today are crucial for you as individuals, because if you make bad judgments, that can rebound on you. Not the RTO so much, because the RTO's responsibility is to make sure that they appoint a qualified, suitably qualified and skilled assessor. But it'll rebound on you as an individual, because when you make judgments in assessment, they are judgments made by you. And so if there was any kind of litigation in the future, that litigation would be have an impact on you personally. And so you need to be able to be sure you've used assessment tools properly. You need to be sure you've made good judgments. And you need to keep records which show that you've done these things. So in lots of ways, today's workshop is about defence. It's not just about surviving an audit. It's about giving you the ability to sleep comfortably at night, knowing that you're not at any kind of risk in terms of the judgments you've made and the decisions you've made on the way through. Yes, Yvette.
So Marie Anderson from the webinar says, sometimes we need to refresh our thinking because we can get lost in the paperwork.
Absolutely. And we're going to have a fair bit of paperwork today. Hopefully we won't get lost in it. But it is awfully easy for systems to just get bigger and bigger and more complex. So the comment you're making there, that there's a chance to go back to first principles, if you like, and rethink how you do things and build simpler systems that are quality systems, so you don't get lost in the paperwork, is really well worth doing. Look, as we go through the day, I'm very comfortable for people to ask questions, to raise concerns, to offer scenarios and exemplars of what you're doing and how it's working. So at any time during my monologue, please feel free to turn it into a dialogue by coming forward with your questions or with your ideas or comments or suggestions. That would be really, really valuable. The references and resources I've already touched on. The only additional resource that will be using during the day are some activity sheets, and so we have two activities. One activity is focused on the use of assessment tools, and the other activity looks at decision making and judgment making, and we'll be getting to those during the morning. All the other resources you have there, but I do need to draw your attention to the fact and remind you that previous workshops are all available online. It's a rather dry way to participate in a workshop watching it online, because you can't interact. You can get angry, you can throw things at your computer, but you can't really interact with the presentation. But I do want to say to those here now and people online that if you are watching a previous workshop and a question or an issue comes up that you really want to have answered, just send me an email and say, look, I've just been watching session 2, I don't quite understand this, or I don't agree with this, or I've got some better ideas about this. That'd be lovely to hear from you. So feel free to contact me if you are going through another workshop from online. Otherwise, it is a very dry kind of process. So please feel free to raise questions as we go through the day. This, as I've said, is now part of the third part of what is now a 4-part series. The design and development of an assessment system looked at the sort of fundamental parameters of why we assess, and we're going to touch a bit on that again today because it's relevant to our topics. And how we build an assessment system in our RTO that will serve all the necessary functions, formalities and requirements of assessment and ultimately certification. We then looked at our second session series at designing assessment tools, and there we looked at the sort of parameters that we needed to take into consideration as we moved from the unit of competency. We use this unit of competency for that purpose, and how you would then write assessment tools to assess the knowledge component, and assessment tools to measure the skills component. Today we now get into the assessment in practice, which is the use of those tools, and in particular where things can go wrong and how we can avoid the sort of common mistakes that people make when using assessment tools. And so it's how we gather evidence, how we make judgments on the basis of that evidence, and I might say that continues to be an area of high level of variability between RTOs. Some RTOs make judgments in a very holistic, impressionistic way on the basis of the evidence, and others make judgments on a very analytical and a very formal process of working with the evidence. And so we need to look at these sorts of different ways of making judgment. It was always interesting to me that right from the beginning, back in the 1990s, and early 2000s, when a lot of material was published about assessment. In fact, some people might be old enough to remember the great big green box of documents on assessment. That great big green box with about 12, I think, documents within it, none of them mentioned judgment anywhere. They all talked about gathering evidence. And there was the assumption that if you gathered a lot of evidence, then the judgment would somehow or other automatically happen. In which case we wouldn't need courts and judges, we would just have police because they gather the evidence. But the really skillful, the really tricky part of the process is how you use that evidence to make a judgment as to whether a person is or is not competent. That's the really tricky part. And I might say that is the part where you as assessors reach your peak in terms of your professional responsibility. Gathering evidence can be done by all sorts of people, but only you can make judgments. So that at that moment you are exercising your highest level of analysis and understanding, and you're also making a judgment which then leads to certification, employment, provision of services in the community. And if you make that judgment wrong, a person might be misemployed, might provide poor services, and that can have calamitous effects. So that point when you make judgment is really, really profound. And therefore, it's surprising to find in all that documentation that it didn't get a mention. It was always mentioned in the definition of competency-based assessment. It was always said, oh, well, it's a process of gathering evidence and making judgments. And then the rest of the documentation just reflected on evidence. So one of the things which we really want to get across today is the significance of that judgment process. And my observation as an auditor is it's still a bit shaky out there in the RTOs. People are getting good evidence now, but still a little bit unsure about where to go with that evidence. Finally, there's records, and that's where we ask the question, well, what do you need to keep? The comment made online then was, well, we're getting snowed over with and overwhelmed with paperwork. And so one of the things we have to ask is, what evidence do we really need to keep? Do we need to keep frozen every meal cooked by this trainee chef? Do we need to keep, I mean, I've seen containers full of welded pieces of metal, each of them carefully labelled with the student's name and date and so on. Vast quantities of evidence being kept. I've seen people with shipping containers gradually filling up with paper as they keep vast records. So we need to revisit that issue so that you don't get overwhelmed with paper. Our final session, which will be in November, about I think the 6th and 7th, is going to look at appeals and validation. And that is basically taking us back to that idea that at the end of the day, we need to know that our assessment system's working well. And part of that evidence will come from whether or not people are appealing against, I mean, I daren't say students are appealing. Most people would disagree with that straight away. But whether students are making appeals or lodging appeals or complaints about assessment, and assessment validation, which is very much part of the standards now in standards 1.9 through 111, but it also is referred to within standard 1.8. So validation is a significant aspect of your responsibility. And again, sometimes we will find as auditors that we find assessment tools that are grossly invalid, and yet the validation record of the RTO says that no, they're fine. And what you have to ask the question is the validation system really working? Is it really actually telling us what we need to know? So that will cap off our program for assessment, and it's pretty comprehensive in that we start at the beginning, which is how you construct a system, and finish up at the end with how do you ask the question, has it all worked? Is it all providing us with a good value as an assessment system? So our topics for today are first to recap key ideas of the previous two workshops. And admittedly, I'll be setting those within the context of today's workshop, but that will make sure that we're all working from the same base when it comes to our discussions. Then this is not surprising, then we're going to be looking at using assessment tools, making the assessment judgment, and keeping assessment records. So we'll be just following that menu for this morning. It's a bit hard to be precise about timing, but morning tea will come in at about 10:15 or thereabouts, and that will be a significant prompt for me to stop talking and for you to have an opportunity to have a snack. And we'll be finishing at about 1 o'clock as planned. So why do we need to use assessment tools? What's the function of assessment tools, and what's the function of assessment overall? And here we need to reflect on the fact that the vet sector is different to other sectors. For a start, your core business as an RTO is to certificate a person's achievement of industry relevant competencies. Industry relevance is important. So when we're talking about assessment tools, as we did last time, the issue of industry relevance is crucial. So when we're using assessment tools, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, is this servicing the needs of industry? When we come to make a judgment, we need to understand that we're making a judgment about this person's readiness for industry. Not for some future time, but when they graduate, when they leave, if it's a one-day course that afternoon, they need to be ready for industry. Now, that's in part defined by industry specification of the competency standards. but it's also very much down to you as assessors being able to say, well, I'm industry experience myself, I understand what industry is asking, I have made proper observations of this person's performance, this person is or is not yet ready for industry. Now that's different to higher education. For example, universities make no statement about whether or not a person's ready for industry, and indeed they probably vigorously deny that they would. But in the vet sector, we are unashamed of saying we are about training people and educating people to be ready for workplaces. So we have to make sure that the person who's making this call is qualified. And we've talked about this before too, but it basically means that you have to be industry skilled. That is, you know how industry that you're training for works. You have to be vocationally competent. That is, you have to yourselves be able to do the thing you're training. And you have to be assessor trained, in our case, assessor trainer trained and assessor trained. You also need to be up to date with what's happening in the vet sector, and all of this is referred to in standards 113 and 114 of those dreaded standards. But the thing about it is that you have to be qualified assessors. So right from the start, you're very different to other sectors, because in other sectors, being a qualified assessor is not apparently important. So that in the higher education sector and indeed in schools, not every teacher is trained in assessment or educational measurement or whatever phraseology they use for it. But in our sector, we do require this because of the nature of the judgment you're making. The judgment you're making has to be valid, reliable, fair and flexible. We'll come back to these notions a bit later on, very briefly, but it is basically saying that the judgment you're making has to meet specific quality standards. We are going to be, of course, looking at judgment today, so we'll come back to those issues then. And the judgment itself must be based on evidence. So we're an evidence-based business, and that evidence has to be gathered through assessment tools, and those tools themselves then must be valid, sufficient, current and authentic. Evidence can come from all sorts of sources, not even, sometimes not actually from a tool, and we're going to look at that too when it comes to judgment. But that evidence, whether it comes from a tool or not, must meet these requirements of being valid, sufficient, current and authentic. And if it doesn't, you throw it out. And there are some people who think, well, it's not really valid, but I've got lots of it. So there's a sort of notion that lots of bad evidence equals good evidence. That's simply not true. Lots of bad evidence is just worse evidence. So it's better to have a small amount of really good evidence than it is to have a vast amount of bad evidence. So you focus your attention on gathering good evidence. It may mean your assessment tool and your processes are quite lean and very well targeted, and that's exactly what we want. We don't want people smothered in paperwork and vast assessment systems. What we want is tightly focused quality systems focused on the requirements of the unit and the requirements of the standards. If we've got those conditions in place, then you can show that you've made good judgments, because you and the RTO are accountable for the accuracy of these judgments. And when I say accountable, I mean legally accountable. And so if there is any kind of litigation because one of your graduates has gone off the rails, then up to about 7 years beyond the training, or should I say beyond the point of assessment, you might need to be able to show that you made good judgments so that your judgment wasn't the problem. Their subsequent performance might be a problem, but your judgment wasn't the problem. If you can't show that your judgment wasn't the problem, then you can be held, at least in part, accountable for that person's poor performance. Now, all you're ever promising is, and I'll get to your question, all you're really promising is at the time of assessment, the person was competent. You can't promise that the person will be competent from the rest of their lives. The lady in the red jacket here. This does mean you need to, first of all, follow proper practices, which was the focus of our workshops, but also that you keep good records. And I might say that it's you that needs to keep good records, as well as the RTO, because if you're no longer employed by the RTO, you still have the potential to find yourself facing litigation. So this is really serious business. It's not like higher education, where a lecturer can use whatever method they like of assessment. In our game, the assessment process is very tightly managed because of the significance of the decision you're making. We have a question.
Just in respect to what you've just said, is it the fact then that the assessor must keep a set of records which are a duplicate of the RTO's set of records?
Certainly like to get to that later on, but I'll answer it straight away because you are. I think it's a very good idea for you to do that. It's tricky, I know, because it might be argued that these are confidential, but these are records of your decisions. So they're actually your records because these are your decisions, the decisions you made. It's certainly that we would argue that the RTO needs to keep those records, but if the RTO goes out of business, then you are out on a limb. You have no, I mean, if you're working within the TAFE sector, for example, you can be very confident that the records will exist for quite some time. But if you're dealing with a small RTO that might or might not continue in its current ownership or operations, then you need to keep in mind that you, as an assessor, made those decisions personally as an assessor. And so you need to be able to defend yourself personally as an assessor. However, when we get to looking at records, you'll see you don't have to yourself hire a container for the records. What you need to be able to demonstrate is that you followed these standards. First of all, you need to be able to establish that you're qualified, appropriately qualified to make the judgments, and then you would need to be able to establish that you gathered evidence that met those requirements, and that you made a judgment that met those requirements, and then you walk away because it's clearly not your fault that this person's gone off the rails. But if you can't show that, then you are at risk. The way I usually put it is your house, your boat, and your car are all up for grabs. So think about it seriously. But it's something which has always been the case in the vet sector, and there has been litigation in Western Australia and in other states which has involved and engaged the assessor as well as the RTO. The RTO is going to be asked the question, how did you manage this? How did you make sure that the assessor was qualified? How did you do validation? Those sorts of questions would be legitimately asked of the RTO, but the judgment is not made by the RTO, it's made by you. And that puts a different complexion on it. And that all the more reason then to be thinking about judgment and records. We've got a question here and then one at the back. Yes.
When you say that we should take and keep a record, how does data protection come into that? So if we have to keep the person's detail and then we're keeping a personal copy, where does that sit?
That's a very good question, and I must confess that I'm not probably the right person to answer that question. I'm going to really only be able to reflect on what kind of records you need to keep. How you keep those records and how you manage them for security and confidentiality is an issue about which I'm not very well versed. But I do think it's a challenge we need to consider, and it might be the sort of thing that TAC needs to think about in terms of its own advice. Because at the moment we generally talk about the RTO keeping records, but the same issue relates to RTOs keeping records. A lot of information ultimately ends up on the USI and AVITMIS, but that's really only about qualifications, and that doesn't give the background to those qualifications or certificates that have been issued. So there's this other layer of evidence and records. So I'm going to be talking about the records I think you need to keep to protect you from, so that you can show that you made a safe judgment. But hopefully what you'll see when we get to those records is that it's not a lot of personal stuff. But keep in mind that what you're keeping about is a record not so much of the student but of the judgment you made. So it's really a record of your actions in relation to the student's performance, rather than a record. I think if we look at it that way, we might be a bit more comfortable about it. But I take your point. It's a very good, very well made point, because it does push us into some grey territory. So we have to weigh that up. There's a question
Two
online?
questions
Yes?
from online. The first one from Marie Anderson.
Hi, Marie.
I have seen assessors add the words competent on the day of assessment. Is this a valid statement to add to the final sign-off? And the second question from Teresa from Central Regional TAFE, that she'd be a bit worried about the validity of the evidence's currency after 7 years.
Oh, that's the point. I mean, if clearly, going back to that issue of 7 years, clearly if the person had just finished the course and had gone off the rails the next day, then you'd be 100% accountable for the problem. If after 5 years they've gone off the rails, then there are a whole bunch of people are going to be answerable to the issue. The manager might have asked them to do things beyond their capabilities. The resources provided to them might not have been appropriate to the task. The work practices in the organisation might not have been conducive to quality performance. And people can just forget stuff, or people can be lazy. So there's lots of things that can interplay with over those years. And it's just that more or less, I think TAC talks about 5 years. I generally talk about 7 years. That you can have some, how can I put it, residual responsibility. But as soon as you show that you made a safe judgment, that residual responsibility vanishes. So that's the first thing. The other comment, though, which was competent on the day of assessment, I mean, there's no harm in saying that. But it is a little bit pessimistic. We would like to think that that it goes beyond that, but I think it is understood, generally understood, without necessarily writing it down, that the judgment is made on the basis of evidence at the time. But it does mean that evidence has to be current. We need to be very clear that if we've allowed in as evidence that is not current, then we are making a dangerous judgment. So that particularly applies with RPL, when a person might present evidence which we have to abandon simply because it may not be true of them now. I've got a trophy on my shelf at home which says I'm an A-grade squash player. That is not current, I can assure you. So, you know, the evidence gradually loses value, and indeed a judgment of competency might gradually lose value. However, it is also true to say that you know, it's like riding a bike, that quite often people, once having acquired a competency, retain it for life. You're all exercising skills today that you learned in kindergarten. So it's, I mean, that doesn't mean that it will necessarily fade. But the other thing that can happen, of course, is that a competency can become aged by virtue of the fact that industry has moved on. So the competency now becomes a T-model Ford competency. It's no longer relevant to what industry is doing now. So it may be that what's happened is that industry's moved on, even though the competency has been retained. So we have lots of reasons for putting a limit to it. It always has bothered me that we've never put a use-by date or a best-before date on our competencies. In the case of, say, life-saving and first aid, there is the notion that you need to be reassessed in order to show that your competency is still current. There were two more questions, then we need to move on.
Wouldn't it be the responsibility?
There's a microphone on its way to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can speak normally.
I know, Cap, but the people online can't hear you.
All right, sorry. Marcus Leone from Safe Lift Consultancy. Wouldn't it be the responsibility of the employer to make sure that if he's employing someone with a set of skills, they make sure that their skills are up to date at the time of employment?
I agree with you. That is good employment practice, but
Yep.
the person might be self-employed,
Okay.
such as a plumber or an electrician. And when you make a judgment that this person's a plumber, you're saying this person can work as a plumber on their own or as an electrician on their own. So there may not be an employer in the picture. But nonetheless, too, employers are quite often, I mean, I remember visiting an RTO which was delivering training, well, not an RTO, beg your pardon, a business that was a restaurant, and it had an apprentice chef, and the employer was an accountant. So, you know, the employer was in fact not equipped to make a judgment as to whether or not people were performing to standard. So you've got this issue of you would hope and like to think that employers could make this call, but quite often employers simply say, you've got the paperwork, you've got the qualification from an RTO, which is quality assured nationally, and so I trust it. So that trust is something we've got to live up to. But I don't disagree with you. I think that, it's a shame, but quite often, if they're self-employed, then there's just going to be, it's only going to be clients that actually evaluate the person's performance. Okay, do we have another question? No, we're fine. Okay, let's move along then. So we have in this sort of the notion of competency-based assessment, and so we see that in the standards that our assessments and our assessment system must comply with the assessment requirements of the training package, which means that the unit of competency, which is the key part of the training package for assessments from an assessment point of view, tells us what we must do, how we must assess. So we have the unit of competency itself and its assessment requirements, strangely and unusually published as two separate documents for no known reason. Those two documents taken together constitute a statement of what the training package requires, and is conducted in accordance with the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, which we'll look at again briefly in a moment. And competency-based assessment, as I've said, is this process of gathering evidence which is then used to make judgments about the achievement of national competency standards. So that gives us a sort of shared framework for thinking about the way in which these processes work. But we also need to just briefly reflect on what competency itself is. And it's the consistent application. So for a start, our assessment tools and our judgment should be asking the question, have I got consistent application? Now, in many cases, I was looking at a unit of competency yesterday, which said one assessment will do. And you sort of think, well, how can you judge consistent application if it's one assessment? I mean, what you're going to get, as it happened, the RTO is using more than one assessment. And indeed, we would recommend that at least two. Gives you an opportunity to vary the context, to make judgments over time, and make a judgment about whether the application is consistent. Because if you just have a one-shot assessment, you're not going to be able to say this person is competent because it requires consistency. Of knowledge and skill, so we're going to have assessments that combine knowledge and skill. And again, when it comes to making judgments, we need to ask ourselves the question, has this person got the knowledge as required by the unit of competency? Has this person got the skills as specified in the unit of competency? But these are to the standard of performance required in the workplace. So we've got to employ our expertise as people who understand the nature of the workplace to say, when we make our judgment, this person is workplace ready. It's not that they've just passed the tests. It's that this person is workplace ready. So our tests need to tell us that. Our assessment tools need to tell us, is this person workplace ready? So you as assessors need to be workplace savvy, I think is a nice word to use. You need to be sort of workplace wise, as distinct from street wise. You need to know how it works in the workplace, because the standard of performance is as required in the workplace. And it embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. This again suggests we need to have more than one assessment, because if we have one assessment, then we only know they can apply the knowledge and skills to one situation. A second assessment tells us they can do it to two situations. And straight away we get a feeling that there's transfer possible. With a one-shot assessment, you couldn't make that call. So when it comes to making judgment, we are saying this person is competent and this is what competency means. So don't lose sight of that definition. There's a lot in there, a lot of very valuable ideas packed into that one statement of what it is to be competent, and therefore what it is to make a judgment that a person is competent. And what sort of records you need to keep in order to back up the judgment that this person is competent. You can see it all hangs together. And there's a kind of rigor and a kind of discipline in this process that you don't find in other walks of life. Mind you, when I've had people sort of complain to me about this and I say, well, what are you? They say, I'm an engineer. This is just engineering for education and training. An engineer would be as thorough about the design of a bridge and wouldn't say, oh yeah, that's near enough, or well, it's not, the bridge isn't long enough, but I've made it extra high. Which is the sort of thing we happen to see in education, where the person says, well, I didn't assess the right things, but I assessed a lot of it. So it's obviously good. The kind of precision that you require in your trade is the kind of precision that we're requiring in your judgments as an educator and a trainer. So when it comes to making judgments, which is again a topic for today, so it's quite legitimate that we reflect on this again, is that they must be fair, flexible, valid and reliable. What do you think fairness means when it comes to making assessment judgments? What do you think fairness means? What's a fair judgment?
It takes into context various... Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
It takes into context various ways of how people undertake a skill.
That's a very good point. So it brings into the notion things like a reasonable adjustment, so that you can say, well, within this particular context or for this particular person, this is legitimate evidence that I can use so that I can make a judgment. So that would be fair. Yep.
This comes back from my area, which is in maritime. You've got different size vessels, different size of propulsion systems, coming alongside a jetty. Different boats have different characteristics. So again, you have to look at what is the item that you're using for the assessment and the skill requirement for that.
So the same competency might be expressed in different ways with different vessels.
That's correct.
And that's perfectly legitimate. In the aeronautical industry, and I can't really speak for maritime, you get a flying license and then you get endorsed for particular kinds of aircraft.
I'm going through that process myself as well.
So there what you've got is you say, well, to be fair, I'm quite happy to judge your fundamental competency on the basis of this specific context, but you would then need to be confident that the competency was transferable. And under those circumstances, you might use simulators, or you might do other things to see that the person could transfer the competency to other environments. But to be fair, you would need to obviously work with what you had. However, that fairness must lead to invalidity. So you mustn't be so fair, so flexible, and so make such extraordinary adjustments that you are no longer measuring the competency that the person had to demonstrate. So there's an interplay here between fairness and validity, and we have to be very careful that we never sacrifice validity in the name of fairness. Other things about fairness are making sure that the student understands exactly what is required. When I suggested that to a university lecturer, he said the students would cheat. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they just learn all that stuff. And I said, well, that's exactly what you want. But he felt that telling the students what the course was about would be enabling the students to cheat. In our case, we tell the students exactly what's expected. We lay it down, if you demonstrate these qualities, you will be competent. So fairness is about that openness, so that the students understand exactly what is required. Being flexible means that, and this is related to fairness, means that you're prepared to accept evidence that comes in from whatever source it might come. And so with flexibility, you are encourages and supports fairness. Validity, though, basically means you must comply with the mandatory unit requirements. And so validity in judgment and in evidence gathering basically means that you are strictly sticking to the requirements of the unit. And that's going to be a very important part of our activity today, because lots of the time when you look at judgments being made, you see no evidence at all of the unit's requirements. People say, oh, they've passed the assessment tools, therefore they're competent. And you'll discover when you do this activity today that it doesn't always flow that way. So we need to look at ways of making sure our judgments are valid, because at the end of the day, that is what we're accountable for. And reliable means that we are consistent in our judgments, that we don't vary our judgments depending on the time of day, or whether we're tired or not, or whether we're one assessor or another assessor. We want systems that are so well engineered that different people using those systems will lead to the same outcomes. And again, we'll explore that when we look at our activity on judgment. All of those judgments must be based on evidence that itself must be valid. That is, our assessment tools must faithfully reflect the requirements of the unit. But also that you as assessors must faithfully use the tools as required. Either the tools you've written yourself or tools that someone else has written. Your job is to use the tool properly. You don't use a screwdriver as a hammer. It's misuse of the tool. You make sure the tool you're using is used properly. That you get sufficient evidence, and this does reflect a little bit on that notion of one-shot assessments. I mean, it still bothers me when I read in the unit of competency that it says that it must be assessed at least once. And you sort of think, well, obviously at least once, but why not say twice? Why not ask for variation in conditions and over a period of time? That was a little mantra that we used to see in units of competency, the sort of range of context and range of materials over a period of time. That was nice because it encouraged this notion of transfer. So sufficiency is an important issue when it comes to gathering evidence. We've talked about that in previous workshops, but this is a bit of a recap, so I'm allowed to mention it again. It needs to be authentic, which means we need to establish beyond any doubt that the person who's produced the evidence, or that the evidence was produced by the person we're assessing, and not by somebody else. And once again, in lots of other contexts, there are a lot of take-home tests, a lot of assignments and projects done at home. You don't know who's done them. So you need to be able to establish the authenticity of the evidence you get. And so if a person's working online, you need to have a mechanism which challenges the evidence to establish that the evidence you're getting online is in fact truly evidence of that person. Now that can be quite a challenge. Less and less as we're getting more and more broadband connections, and we're able to have a kind of virtual reality where our virtual presence, if you like, online. But the problem still remains as to with online assessment, and for that matter RPL, where we might be using evidence from some distant past, that we have an issue of authenticity. Who is this really evidence of? And then currency, which is basically saying the evidence has to be sufficiently fresh to be able to make a reasonable judgment that the evidence is about the person now, because this is the point at which we're going to make the judgment. So these qualities of evidence need to be enshrined in the way we write our assessment tools, which was the last time's session. And it's only evidence that meets these requirements that are allowed to be part of our judgment, which is today's session. So let's look at using assessment tools. And when we think about using assessment tools, we need to recognize that these tools may be ones that we wrote ourselves. They may be tools that we purchased. And in the last session, when we reflected on tools that we are using, we need to be able to establish that these are, in fact, tools that meet these rules of evidence. So one of the things that we expect to see people doing, although it's not mandatory, but we expect to see people do is to establish the validity of the tools by doing a mapping. And quite often you'll buy some assessment tools, and if you do a mapping, you'll discover that there are horrific holes in the tools, things that are simply not covered. And in those circumstances, people have to do supplementation. And sometimes those tools are written by the very people who wrote the standards, and they still get it wrong. So you need to make sure that when you're using assessment tools that are made up by somebody else, that they have been validated, that you have checked to make sure that they're going to give you evidence that you can truly accept. So when it comes to using assessment tools, it could be assessment tools that you wrote, and we would expect you to be able to see the process by which you establish the reliability and validity and overall quality of those tools. And indeed that comes in under Standard 1.8, so that's part of our inquiry under Standard 1.8. Or they might be purchase tools, in which case we want to see how you have established that those purchased tools are in fact acceptable and legitimate tools. Because after all, these are the tools you're going to be using to make judgments. And therefore, it's a bit like when you get into a hire car. You go around and check the tyres, you go and check the mirrors, you set it up. It's not your car, but you are, as soon as you sit behind the wheel, you're accountable for the quality of that car. And the same thing is true when you use an assessment tool. Not your tool, but as soon as you use it, you become accountable for the quality of that tool. So it may be that the person using the tool is you, beg your pardon, is the person who you're using your own assessment tool. There's, generally speaking, nothing complicated about that. You, after all, designed the tool. The only thing I would worry about here is that people can become so comfortable with their own assessment tools that they stop using them properly. Isn't that weird? They become complacent, they become overconfident, they begin to say, oh, I don't need to go through that checklist because I know it. And we had a disastrous accident, an aeronautical accident at Melbourne Airport, Essendon Airport I think it was, where the pilot was so experienced that he no longer went through his checklist, and he didn't check that one of the positions of one of the I've forgotten what the term is now, but was incorrect. And so when he took off, the plane veered to one side. Now, if he'd gone through his checklist, he would have found that, fixed it, and there would have been 5 people alive today that aren't. And it came down to the fact that he was a highly experienced, well-qualified, extraordinarily good pilot who didn't go through his checklist. And that's scary stuff. So as assessors, we may be so confident about the use of our tools that we stop using them properly, and that is a little bit bizarre. And so you need to keep going back to yourself and saying, I will work through this methodically. I will not take shortcuts. Stick to the script. Other qualified assessors, there might be other qualified assessors from your RTO who meet the requirements of standards 113 and 114. They will be using the tools that you wrote or that you purchased. And so again, they need to stick to the script. They need to comply with what's required. And again, they need to be able to swallow their own preferences and suppress their own desires and stick to the tool as it's written. Again, you'll find people who say, well, I don't really agree with this. Well, I'm sorry, but this is the authenticated, validated tool. Whether you like it or not, this is what you do. To change the script could be to invalidate the assessment and make a faulty judgment. It could be observers under supervision. I couldn't quite find the right words for this, but these are people who are operating under standard 117 to 120. That is, they're people working as observers. They're not allowed to be assessors. They're not allowed to make judgments. They're employed by the RTO, but they are not yet qualified. They will probably have, or nowadays they need to have an assessor skill set, but under standard 1.17, they are not permitted to make judgments. And of course, you've got third-party observers, people who are making observations on your behalf. And those people, when they're using assessment tools, need a lot of support. So, for example, they need to be committed to your RTO's quality requirements. So you need to make sure that they are briefed and if necessarily, coached or trained to understand what it is you require. And that does mean that when you write your assessment tools, you need to provide the assessor with, the observer, with very clear instructions as to what they are required to do, so they don't deviate from the script. These third-party observers need to have direct access to the candidate. That may seem odd, but you might find that the person, that the candidate is out on the road and the observer is in the office. We've even had people doing training in rural production when the assessor or the observer is in the head office and the student is out on a station somewhere in the northwest. You know, it's basically, if you don't have access to the individual, direct access to the candidate, you can't be a third-party observer. So you need to establish that. I might say, by the way, you would need to make sure there was no conflict of interest, like it wasn't the dad assessing the son or the daughter, that there was no direct link which would lead to. I remember when we first started looking at apprenticeship training, we found one apprentice who was apprenticed to a hairdresser was apprenticed to the employer in a small country town. It turned out that she was the employer. So she was apprenticed to herself. And in those days, the assessment was done by the employer, so she was able to assess herself and did very well. Mind you, it was in a country town, so who cares? But in those days, if you were in a country town outside the metropolitan area, you did not have to be a registered hairdresser. The only registrations were done of people in metropolitan areas. So it was possible for a person to be their own employer. And under those circumstances, significant conflict of interest could arise. Understanding of assessment tools. And I think I don't know why I've got an asterisk on this. Yes, I do. It's down the bottom. So I really need to flip to the bottom so I can refer to it. The assessment tools may be expressed by you as an assessor in a way which is kind of foreign to a third-party observer. A third-party, you might be using language and phrases that belong to the unit of competency or belong to a particular niche of the industry with which you're familiar. But the assessor, the third-party observer, I should say, might not have that experience, might not have that breadth of experience that you have. So you may need to contextualize. You may need to change the language. So if you're dealing with aged care, the standards might refer to clients, but this observer might really refer to people as residents or even as patients. What I guess I'm getting at is you have to ask yourself the question, is there language within the context of this assessment tool that will be strange to the third-party observer? And in those circumstances, you can change the language. You may not change the meaning. That would be an unreasonable adjustment, but you can change the language so that the person will now understand what the assessment tools mean. And finally, a third-party observer must be prepared to participate in briefings, monitoring and validation. In other words, they cannot operate outside your sphere of control. They may not be your employee, they won't be your employee. They may be doing this work on a voluntary basis, but they must submit themselves to the quality assurance requirements of the standards and of the RTO. And if they don't, then they can't be your third-party observer, because you couldn't necessarily trust without validation the evidence that they're providing you with. I mean, they could provide you with evidence, but when it came to the judgment of whether this was authentic or whether this was valid, you would be left with a question mark. You wouldn't be able to answer that, and you have to discard the evidence anyway. So whether or not with a third-party observer, when they're using assessment tools, you have some form of agreement, I would recommend you have some form of agreement which they sign. And you might need to remind them ever so gently that they are legally accountable for the quality of the evidence they provide. So it's not a matter of tick and flick. It's not a matter that when they see you coming up the driveway that they suddenly get out all the tools that they haven't filled in and flick them, tick them and sign them quickly before you arrive at the front door. This is a serious business. They need to take it seriously, and if they can't take it seriously, you don't want them as your observers. They're useless to you. They are very valuable, though, if you can get this sort of agreement. I mean, they enable you to gather evidence from workplaces that you may not be able to reach. They enable you to gather evidence from performance all scattered around the state to where you might have students long distances away. They enable you to cope with large enrollment numbers, so that if you have a lot of students, you can outsource a lot of the observation to third parties. And they enable you to bring into play specialist observers, people who have a special understanding of a particular vessel or a particular circumstance. I was almost going to say docking procedure, but then that would be just self-aggrandizement. But what I guess I'm getting at is that you can bring in specialists as observers as well. So there's lots of good reasons for having them, but there's also lots of dangers. So you need to make sure that those dangers are identified and dealt with. There are other things that we also expect when we're using assessment tools. The first is pretty obvious, and that is to follow the instructions for the administration of the tool. And the number of times you find people who are not doing that is a bit scary. That they need to reinforce instructions to candidates. And what this means basically is saying, well, the candidate has been given instructions. You as an observer need to make sure the candidate knows what they mean. And it might mean some contextualization, because the candidate may not fully understand what is being asked of them. And you, as an observer, need to reinforce and assist them and support them in following their instructions. So you need to keep to the script or the assessment plan. So the assessment plan might have certain timings or certain conditions or certain arrangements. You need to stick to that. You need to make sure that you don't customize the tool. Now, I said before contextualize, and I want to draw a distinction between these two. Contextualize simply means that you set the tool within its context. That's just about language. Customization would be where you leave bits out or add bits in that are not part of the standards and not a part of the tool. You're not allowed to do that. We did come across an RTO that in fact left out a whole element of competency because it wasn't done by that particular institution. And we had to point out to them that it was not their standards, that these were national standards. And even though they didn't do it, they still needed to teach it and assess it. They might well say to their students, yeah, well, we're going to teach you this and we're going to assess you on this, but we don't do it. That's fine, you're allowed to say that. But what you're not allowed to do is cut it out of the tool. Because that person could then go and work in another place where it is done with a statement that says they're capable of doing this component, and in fact it's based on absent evidence. You must make sure you use legitimate question and answer techniques. We don't have the time today to dwell on question and answer techniques, but it is awfully easy to ask leading questions. And one of the problems that we've often found is with assessors is that they keep throwing answers to the student until, I beg your pardon, the student keeps throwing answers to the assessor until the right answer appears and the assessor says good and moves on to the next question. Sort of talking horse process. So we need to make sure that our question and answer techniques are legitimate. And there again, we would encourage the use of open-ended short questions rather than multiple choice. Multiple choice questions don't reflect reality. They're exceptionally hard to write, and they don't provide much opportunity for contextualization. Whereas you can ask an open-ended question in a number of different ways, and so that the student will understand exactly what you mean. Follow strict observation protocols. So if there's a protocol set down for observation, you have it in your hand and you follow it strictly. And you look for the specific requirements with precision. And you look out for plagiarism and challenge the questions of authenticity. And particularly if you're dealing with people at a distance or online. And that may mean that you have to introduce some quite heroic strategies to make sure that what you're getting is really evidence of this person and not of their mum or dad or brother or a good friend. We might also need to think about, when we're using assessment tools, how can we reduce the candidate's stress and anxiety? And look, stress and anxiety need not be part of the game. It is an artifact now. You notice that there's lots of kids going up the wall with stress and anxiety as they approach their Year 12 exams. And every year we have this discussion about stress and anxiety in Year 12. But it need not be part of the picture. The fact that they've got the standards and that they can see what it is you're expecting and that it's an open system for assessment and that you can be flexible and fair should reduce stress and anxiety. But even still, people are going to experience it. And stress and anxiety can really interfere with their ability to perform, to remember stuff, and to be able to do stuff. So it's important that you reduce stress and anxiety. Some circumstances are going to be implicitly stressful, but you don't have to add to it by overlay it. I come across people who say, no, it's an important part. We need to know that they can cope with the rigors of real life. Well, I mean, that's just it's just an excuse for being nasty, I think. Comply with OH&S and EO requirements, and this is also very important, that you consider the task you're asking them to perform, and are there any challenges or risks in terms of occupational health and safety, and are there dangers that you will be prejudiced in your judgment by virtue of maybe they have a disability, or maybe they are of what you think is the wrong gender, or whatever. So you need to be very careful that when you're using assessment tools, that you are very conscious of these requirements and don't allow your judgments or your observations to be coloured by the absence of attention to these issues. You need to provide suitable feedback during assessment. Now, suitable means that you're not actually prompting them to produce the right answer. But feedback might be about reducing stress and anxiety. Feedback might be about encouragement. Feedback might be reinforcement. Feedback is an important thing, but you might need to specify what feedback is legitimate, particularly if you're using a third-party observer, because you don't want so much feedback that the person is really having the assessment done for them. You need to monitor the assessment process and contribute to continuous improvement. And that does mean that you might want to follow up assessments with questions to the candidate and questions to the observer about how well the assessment tool worked and what the assessment experience was like. So that, and it always bothers me when you get students who come out of an examination, you say, how did you go? And they say, I don't know. And you think, well, that's scary. They didn't know, clearly didn't know the standards. They clearly didn't know how well they had performed. It should be that when assessment is done, it feels right. It feels appropriate. The person shouldn't feel that they've been through some sort of foreign experience. And so getting feedback from the student about how it felt to be assessed is a perfectly legitimate thing and a proper thing to do. And then your job is, as an observer, as an assessor, as an observer or an evidence gatherer, is to provide evidence to the decision maker. And that takes us to our second topic, which is decisions. But before we do, I'm going to ask you to give some thought to challenges that are involved in using assessment tools. Now, I'm going to hand this out now, and then we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about this after the break. But you might want to consider this. In 1985, I published a paper on the problems with assessment. It was problems that I identified looking at 125 trades, and in those days, in 1985, 86, we had what were called apprenticeship officers, who were, generally speaking, very experienced tradespeople, pretty well all men. I think they probably were all men, who were experienced in their trades, automotive, boot making, locksmithing, everything across the trades that were being offered at that time. And they would go out and conduct assessments of apprentices in the field. And I'd been asked I was at the time a university lecturer for my sins, but I was asked if I would conduct a review of their assessment processes, and it was mind-boggling. I might say, by the way, that within Western Australia there was also TAFE assessments, and they were almost entirely multiple choice, and extraordinarily bad. I'm talking about the 1980s, so it don't take any of this personally. But everyone said, no worries, because we've got these we've got these trade examiners to go out and do these assessments. And what I saw in the field was every kind of assessment sin being committed. I don't think I saw any decent, meaningful assessments taking place. I mean, it ranged from having a beer with the employer saying, "How's the kid going? He's going fine, tick." And he'd get his trade certificate. To some people who were fastidious in their process of assessment, but completely off the mark, because they had their own idea about what the trade was, and that's how you were assessed. It might not have anything to do with what industry was doing, but this is what, you know, I, as the pinnacle of the trade, think the assessment's about. It wasn't helped by the fact that in those days the trade standards were published in a little green book. I don't know if any of you remember the little green book. Little tiny green book, about a quarter of the size of an A4 page, big print. Most of the pages were blank, or told you that it was meant to be blank. Many of these were published in about 1900 in vast quantities, and then kept on racks in the department and were handed to the apprentices and their employers and others as time went on. And in the small trade, they were still handing out stuff that talked about steam engines and other things of that kind. I mean, it was truthfully scary. So here we had assessors who were not really knowledgeable about industry as a whole, and in some cases one of the assessors was 80 years old, hadn't touched the tools of trade for 40 years. He was in locksmithing, and he didn't know that there were electronic locks. He just knew that key operated locks, and that's all he assessed on. So what we had is this really scary stuff. So I wrote this report, and as a consequence, we developed NATAS, New Apprentice Training Assessment System. NATAS, we discovered later on, is Satan backwards. But nonetheless, the NATAS system, and I produced this little paper on the things that I found. And it just so happened that there were 30, I don't know why 30, might be a satanic number, of these problems. So I published this paper, and we introduced competency-based training and assessment. In 2001, I was asked to write another paper on assessment. I thought, let's revisit what people are doing. And I discovered when I wrote out a list of things that I was seeing going wrong, it was the same list. That was spooky. So I'm giving you this list of 30 things. And what I want you to do between now and after the break is to just simply circle any number that refers to a problem that you still see. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about what you have seen. So it might be you, but it might be someone else. And you're not going to write your name on this, so I won't be asking. However, yeah, I'm just remembering where it came from. Each of these has got have your thumbprint on it. And what I'd like you to do then at each table is to select one issue and then think about why is it a problem, what effect it could have, and how it could be avoided. And in that way, and then if each table would share their observations with the whole room, then I am going to take them all up and do the fingerprint test, because I thought, you know, I've got really experienced and interesting people here today. I could write another little paper, couldn't I? What's happened in 2018? I'm hopeful to find that the list is now shorter, but it might not be. So if we could give these out, could you give some of these out, Pokua? And as soon as you've got your paper, you might have a look at it. But we'll now take a break and have some morning tea. So there's 3 here. 1, 2, 3, 4 here. 1, 2. Oh, you're on this table, Pokua? You're way ahead of me. Okay. Break, yes. Can we make it 10 minutes? No, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. 25 to. Those of you who are online, if you've got, we're looking at activity 1, so if you would like to have a look at your list, again, circle any of the numbers that relate to problems you've seen, and then if you'd like to share those with us during the feedback session that will follow our morning break. But in the meantime, please go to your kitchen and get yourself a cup of coffee. And we'll show you pictures of what we're eating. The task though is I'm really just breaking in so that you can start doing what you were doing a moment ago, which is to talk about things. Is to just run through this list. If you see something if you read something there that you have seen happening in assessments anywhere at all in your RTO, or even an assessment that you might have gone through yourself when you've been assessed, if any of those things apply, just put a circle around the number, and then for the table, if you would pick out one topic and give some thought about why it's a problem, what effect it might have, and how it can be avoided. In about 5 minutes' time, we'll have a bit of a chat. Those of you online, again, if you would like to run through that list, and then if you can't obviously talk about it across the table, but if you would like to share with us some observations, I think these are pretty well self-explanatory. But if there's any one of these which is not something you recognise, then please feel free to ask me what something means. Yes. Number 11. Assessment by training immersion is interesting, isn't it? I would come across people who would say, I don't need to assess, I just need to make sure that they're in their training. And they basically say, well, if they've survived the training, they must be competent. So it's just basically train. If you're still with us, we can sign you off as competent. And it's just this sort of notion of immersion. I've seen that in places where people say, well, I don't need to have an assessment tool, I just know. I've been in the business for a long time, I just know. And so they would sign people off as competent and even fill in checklists with vast numbers of ticks just to say, I just know. So this sort of notion of not really assessment, but just survival. It's not uncommon. Let's take a look at it this way. In universities in the UK, you don't do assessments after, I think, second year. After that, by simply serving out your time, reading for your degree, if you finished it, you get your degree. You don't actually do an assessment. Now that's true of the Ivy League universities. It may not be true of the red brick ones, but the sort of notion is that assessment is regarded as kind of unpleasant.
But
so
what they showed in their tutorials
yes,
they had the interaction.
Yeah. So there's a sort of notion that if you've participated, if you're engaged, then that's what we want.
Yeah. I was just going to say that's part of the tutorial system that they operate on. You have to attend their tutorials. The tutorial system here in Australia is entirely different. Yes, you still have to attend the tutorials because that's how you get the information about your assignments and assessment requirements. But and that sort of contributes to what the functions of the degree or particular unit that you're doing within your degree. So there is still that assessment, but it is subjective.
It's assessment by immersion, by being there. Yeah. Okay, folks. Let's just take 5 minutes of your time, and whilst you're working, I just want to say a few things to camera, if I can. If someone online is from another state, and I'm thinking particularly of Queensland, but there are, I think, some people from Victoria as well, I need to stress that the views expressed in the documentation is that of TAC, and to some extent of me, and there may be some slight dislocation occasionally with what ASQA might say. So I do need to stress that this is a workshop tailored for the Western Australian scene. Please draw from it what you can, but if there are issues that you feel are different or ways of dealing with things that are different to what you experience in your state or with ASQA, please feel free to contact me and we can talk about it. Thanks. Who's going to speak for this?
See, we've just been talking about number 23.
Okay, number 23. Yes, and I mean, tick and flick is not necessarily mindless. I put the word mindless in because sometimes it's just tick and flick. In other cases, people are actually considering what they're ticking. So I guess it's and flick that's the problem. But it's yeah, we've got to watch out. We're often accused of this when we use checklists and so on. So the word mindless is important because there can be mindful ticking. Yeah. Okay. Just who's going to report for this table? I'll ask at the time. Yeah. How's it going? You're finding a few? Good-o. And have you come to some decided which one you're going to look at? Number 3. Oh yes, that is a particularly pertinent one to pick on. Okay, how are you going, guys? Are you getting lots of circles?
Yeah.
Which one are you going to talk about?
I like number 10.
Not gathering any evidence at all. Brett, do you have any evidence to base that on?
I'm looking at 16. Some courses require group activities like
Yes.
scaffolding, so
Yeah.
you need to work autonomously as a group member to be able to do scaffolding.
Yeah. And that actually raises some interesting questions because if the competency itself has to happen in a group, then you've still got to be able to somehow or other discern the individual from the group, but also and how the individual works with the group is important. But at the end of the day, you're certificating an individual.
Well, 17 goes with, so not knowing who's done the work, what you do is a challenge test.
Ah, yes.
So
Yeah.
what I do is when I get players coming in with their homework, before they attend the course, they should be able to answer any one of those questions.
Absolutely.
If they can't, I turn it off.
Yeah, and basically you're saying, well, look, because this evidence hasn't been substantiated, the whole lot of it is in the bin. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, challenge testing is a nice way of putting it. How you guys going? Have you got lots of circles? Okay.
Not lots.
Not lots. Well, you've obviously been working in a very refined environment where nothing goes wrong.
Very exactly.
So which one are you guys going to talk about?
Well, we've been talking about one shot.
One shot, yeah, that's a nice one to talk about. Yeah. Do we have lots of circling? Have you got your fingerprints on the page? Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you. Oh, it's some DNA as well. Thank you. So what are you going to... Oh, heavens, you've been around, Stephen. Which one are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about? No, okay. They've just been rabbiting on, have they? We're going to call you to some account in the moment. Yes. If it was possible to get. Okay, folks, if I could have your attention, as a survey, this is a fairly a blunt instrument because when you circle something, it's because you've seen it. It doesn't necessarily mean you've seen it lots of times. It's kind of, but nonetheless, I would like to collect up these pages from you before you leave today, because I'd like to do a little compilation to see where you are still observing issues that we observed when I look at it, 1985. That's a long time ago. But I'd like to just go from table to table, and if I could start with this table, and Sophia has volunteered, or at least the two people on either side of her has volunteered her to comment on which topic have you picked as to...
Good afternoon, everyone. I've picked
Okay, folks, Sophia has the floor.
I've picked 8, which is assessment of irrelevant knowledge and skills. And personally, this is just an example I'm going to share, and that is mandating that students reference to APA or Harvard Referencing Guide. And even though the assessment, when it comes to context in terms of what students are physically able to achieve, it's clearly satisfactory, but students get sent back assessments because they have not appropriately referenced to the APA Referencing Guide or Harvard Referencing Guide. And this is not a unit that is analyze and present research information. It's any other unit, but then again, that's what is required.
It's a classic, actually. I haven't come across that lately, but I used to. Particularly in, say, areas like accounting and so on, where there was an interface between the vet sector and the higher education sector. And it was interesting, the higher education sector was saying to the RTO, your graduates need to have been trained in referencing. And I don't have a problem with that. The only thing is that it can't become part of the vet assessment. So you say, well, you've got other criteria you're interested in, fine, create an assessment tool that I can administer on your behalf. But it will not impact on my judgment of this person's achievement of the competency. So it's assessment of irrelevant knowledge and skills can be a significant issue, particularly because of those other players like higher education having an impact, and also because people say, oh, well, you know, we're better than these standards, we do things much better than these standards, so we're going to introduce our own stuff. So that is a serious problem. And what it can do is disenfranchise people who would actually be competent. So I've seen people who are doing Certificate 1 who were failing because they were not performing to more elevated standards. And when I spoke to the trainer, he said, oh, but my job was to lift the standards. And I said, no, your job is to reflect the standards, not to lift the standards. The standards are lifted by your students progressing through the training beyond Certificate 1 into Certificate 2 and beyond Certificate 2 into Certificate 3. That's how standards lift. But your job is not to say, oh, well, yeah, you might have achieved the Certificate 1 unit, but actually I'm going to call to fail because I think you're better than that. And we can't go down that line. Thank you for that, Sophia. That was really interesting. Example and a slightly scary one, because you can see that people would feel this very strongly, that proper referencing was important. Yes.
We chose a 23 mindless tick and flick assessment.
Yes.
We had all seen that, and Russell pointed out it's mindless is the key word here. We could be mindfully ticking and flicking and that would be okay, but if it's just more of a flick and the mindlessness, that was important. Why it's a problem? It might be as a result of an overconfident assessor who thinks they already know everything. It could be laziness, could be a result of being time poor or too many assessments.
Or inundated with paperwork, as was mentioned earlier today.
Or a lack of skill of knowledge on part of the assessor. And the impact would be that someone could be assessed as competent and they aren't, or and they're not getting the adequate feedback through that process. So the solution, or can be avoided, were to improve your assessment tools, allow for sufficient assessment time, re-educate assessors, moderate assessment judgments, and having in-house standards on how to assess.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very comprehensive response. So it's not the ticking that's the problem. And so when people often see an assessor working through a checklist, they say, oh, that's just tick and flick. Well, it's not. If the person is making an observation and recording it with a tick, that is not mindless tick and flick. So we've got to be very careful that we don't get punished by some people who say, oh, well, and you get people who say, oh, if it was written down, what you saw, then it wouldn't be tick and flick. And what are you going to write? You're going to write down what's already written there. So ticking is basically saying, I saw what I was required to see. And it's no different to writing it out longhand. So we've got to be very careful that we don't find ourselves having to defend the ticking process. It's perfectly legit, just not mindlessly, or as you say, under undue pressure. This table, what would you like to add? Which one will you find?
We chose number 3.
Uh-huh.
Observers no current industry knowledge. Probably not so much observers as also the trainers with no industry knowledge. I've been in cases where
I'd have to block my auditor ears at this point.
I work for Linfox operational training. We're well above those standards.
And Pocular is not here.
I was very surprised when I worked with Linfox that the standards that we do maintain, and when I think about where I've worked in the past,
that was the paid advertisement for Linfox.
But a lot of the smaller RTOs, I suppose, because they haven't got enough trainers, they want to try and multi-skill their current trainers. So guys without experience, they try and train up in whether it be working heights, confined space. I remember I did a confined space course. I delivered it. This is probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Not currently, we don't do confined space. And that's the sort of thing that they're relying on trainers. I'm in the driver trainer industry, heavy vehicle, light vehicle, and the prerequisite to being a driver trainer is you've got a driver's license, and that's it, with no experience apart from driving your own car.
Yeah, you'll find sometimes that they'll say, oh, look, we need some extra trainers. They train up one of the administrative staff to do a unit of competency, and they figure that because the person's now got the unit, that they can train and assess. And of course, Standard 113 says, no, much more than that, vastly more than that.
But we've got driving instructors out there. They pass a driving test with licensing, and they're a licensed instructor. You can get Cert 3s and Cert 4s, but it's not mandatory. So how we improve that, I'm not sure, but just with trainers like that, they're not passing on, in a lot of cases, the right information, especially if you've, like my case, delivered one course. I got halfway through that course, got embarrassed, and I didn't deliver it. There was somebody else who actually took over. And I was concerned that I'm passing on the wrong information, especially with confined space. Someone's going to die. And that sort of hit me halfway through presenting the course. So that's what I'm a little bit concerned about now, because there's a few of the smaller RTOs that just can't afford to put on trainers or even bring in other trainers from outside because of the costs.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the standards prior to the current set, which is 2015, did not require current industry skills. It required that you had the vocational competence to the level, which meant that you could do the training and the next day you could become a trainer within that area yourself. And it was very quickly recognised that that was not acceptable. So there are two facets to the new, not I say new standards, the 2015 standards. One was Standard 1.13, which talks about current industry skills, and the other part of that, those standards is Standard 1.6 and 1.5, which talks about industry engagement. I'm just watching Pocular's lips because she's actually reciting the the standards for me. That talk about the industry engagement, and that industry engagement should lead to greater industry skills. Now, well, this is it. One of the problems we've had is that industry engagement is often, I'll show you my training, rather than saying, hey, what do you do in this industry? So one of the things, and you'll see this in the industry engagement fact sheet, which says, no, it's much more important that you spend time learning what industry does than industry spends time learning about what you do. It's this point of having current industry skills. Now, you might have industry skills from the past, but are they current? So the currency comes from maintaining that engagement with industry. So thanks for that. That's a very important one. Thank you, Kieran. And this table, who's Muggins at this table? Okay.
Okay, but 16 and 17.
Oh, you're doing two?
I'm going to do two. Because we discussed this.
Okay.
So group evidence rather than individual evidence. Well, if you're doing a SCAF course, work at heights course, any rigging courses, there has to be minimum of 3 to 5 people to conduct the activity to know there's competency, because you've got to work in the team environment, and it's actually in the units of competency how you've got to assess not just individual, but how they work in the team. So
what's the problem with that then?
The problem is that if there's just a bunch of mates, it should be right, mate, that they'll do stuff for each other, and they're not actually being assessed individually as well as being a group member.
So you might have a rider, a person who's not doing much at all.
That's it.
Is just cheering the group on.
And that's it. And so the big Maori boys are throwing the scaffold, and the little fella just sits back and let them do all the heavy work, and then someone comes on with the pod, you go whack, and that's she's done.
Yeah.
So they're not seeing that the individual can do it.
So that brings us to not knowing who's done the work, doesn't it?
Exactly.
But, and you'll find that with project work. You'll get a bunch of students who do a project, and you know, it's beautifully presented and so on, and there are 5 young people standing there looking proud, and 1 or 2 of them haven't done a thing.
But the other part, not knowing who's done the work. So I challenge test people.
Yes.
So someone says, I've done this, I know that. Righto, buckaroo, there's a crane.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
This. Show me how to do this and that. And they look at me stupidly like I said, that's not a crane driver's job. I said, there's the door.
Yeah.
If they can't do the simple stuff. So I challenge test.
And that's really what's needed. When I used to be involved with the Office of Overseas Skills Recognition, and they had sent troops of people around the world to study what training was done in every country of the world. Wonderful thing to do. I never got to do it. And they'd come back with vast amounts of data about all the training offered in institutions around the world, so that if somebody rocked up and said, I'm from Portugal and I've done this qualification, we could look at it and say, well, that's roughly equivalent to an Australian plumber, so we'll give you a plumbing certificate, or we'll give you credit towards a plumbing certificate. And an enormous amount of effort was gone into trying to cross-check between the overseas qualification and the local one. Now, there were 2 problems. One was that we had no knowledge of what the local standards were, because this predated national standards. So there was a difficulty in cross-checking something with nothing. But that's beside the point. All you have to really say is, you think you're a plumber, come outside and show me your plumbing.
Exactly.
I'll rephrase that. Let me start again. Let me come outside and show me how you plumb. You want us to be so careful. That could be wiped from the because fundamentally the person's got the skills. So it's a challenge test, and it's exactly. That was disastrous. It's exactly where we go.
To know that it's a valid and reliable assessment, I film and photograph my assessments to prove whether they've gone wrong or not.
And this, again, that helps you to substantiate, and it deals with our topic for next time, which is appeals.
That's it.
Would you like to move to another table? But that really was valuable, and apart from my faux pas, the issue of group evidence is a big issue. And you'll often see where performance in a group is the natural, like in acting or something, where it's a natural phenomenon that it happens. You still, at the end of the day, you've got to be able to certificate individuals, and that they can play their part in the group, but they can also perform the various aspects of competency as defined in the standards. And not knowing who's done the work is a critical issue, and so those are still problems that we have to deal with. We do get into fairly serious arguments with RTOs about the group work kind of thing. Absolutely, yeah, and watch this person and see if they actually do anything. This table, what would you like to contribute?
Number 4, no mapping of assessment tools to the standards.
Right.
While engaging an RTO, they gave me an assessment with a load of units of competency and said, this is what's delivered nationally, and I checked different states, all the same. Within there, I found 1 unit of competency, 1 qualification, that had 84 prerequisites.
Oh, ouch. Yes.
They weren't being delivered. They weren't being delivered nationally, and so it had massive implications.
Yes.
We're working in the gas sector, and for each job that you go out to do, you're liable. So first of all, to be able to go and do the job under the standards, you have to have a certificate of competency. If you haven't got that unit, then your certificate is invalid. If your certificate's invalid, that invalidates the standards. The standards then comply with the regulation. The regulation complies with the Act. For every breach of the Act, you're liable for $25,000 for every breach. So you now look at 140 people, all with a certificate of competency, and none of them have any validity, and they go out and do, let's say, 6 jobs a day. It's massive.
It becomes a serious.
You have to go back and look, even simple things, prerequisites. All of us know how to look at the prerequisites, go and check whether the prerequisites have prerequisites.
Absolutely.
So go back and check, because you might be using something that everyone uses.
I remember dealing with an organisation that was delivering training in in operating coating surfaces whilst hanging on ropes, and they hadn't paid any attention to the fact that there were a bunch of prerequisites which enabled them to, for example, fasten the rope correctly at the top, and also carry out safety procedures and emergency procedures in the event that there's a problem with a person whilst hanging on a rope. And I think the point about it is that the prerequisites are there because they are in fact part of the foundations of the competency, and to leave them out is dangerous. Mind you, the competency standards of today tend not to have prerequisites. But certainly there are quite a number of fields where prerequisites are still cited, and they must be part of the judgment. Now, they're part of the judgment. They're not part of the assessment as such, but they are part of the judgment. That is, the judgment cannot be made that this person's competent until another judgment has been made that they've got the prerequisite, and that may cascade back down through to lower levels. So it's really, really important. Thank you for that. And this table, we've got a microphone for you. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. I chose the one for out-of-date assessment tools and materials.
Yes.
I work for a large training organisation, one of the metropolitan TAFEs, and there's a situation where a training organisation can become too big for itself, and it can't fund everything that it wants to do. And we've, for a number of years, had a problem where we're asked to deliver courses and the curriculum has to fall on the shoulders of the lecturer, who only has limited resources and time. That means that some of the tools are never updated and they become out of date. And the other problem we have is not that the tools are just left alone, but in my particular industry, in building design, the knowledge and training has just gone exponential in the last 15 to 20 years. We've moved from a drawing board to a digital age. And with the advent of things like software, our software is just moving so fast that we have a difficulty even keeping current with our own software. And so some of us in our training areas, we have this problem of our assessment tools really don't reflect what is happening at the moment in the industry. Even the industry is struggling to grapple with the speed of which things are turning. And we could fall into the trap of telling industry what it should do, but that's not our role. Our role is to find out what industry is doing and then follow suit. So in our area, particularly because we have a lot of intellectual property that is created by various people like architects and builders, getting industry involvement to try and keep current can be very difficult because they have intellectual property they want to protect. And yet they still want us to be able to train people for their workplace. So getting up-to-date assessment tools and materials is a real struggle for us at the current time.
Thank you for that. I think there's an interesting number of points within the context of that. One of them is that competency in its purest sense should be, to some extent, time independent. By that I mean the kind of qualities you use to use software today are not all that different to the kinds of qualities you bring to bear when you're using software some time ago. So we all evolve with the software. And so you could look at competencies associated with the use of software with a slightly outdated system in terms of what they can practice on, but still be learning the skills that they could then adapt and use and transfer to the latest software, because let's face it, as you've said, software has a half-life of about 6 months. Almost every 6 months something new comes in which case you've got yourself a situation where you are always chasing the standards. So one of the things to look at is to try to make sure that the training we deliver not only is embedded in a context of today's or your software availability, but also reflects on what they might need to do to transfer to a new context. So that you can cope with that a little bit. Another way you can cope with it, of course, is that if the standards say that this old unit is equivalent to the new unit, then that does enable you to at least think that you could use more or less the same training materials and more or less the same assessment tools, but you would need to map. You would need to map the new against the old, because you may find that there are variations where, even though it's functionally the same, in terms of the detail, it's slightly different. So keeping up with a rapidly changing area, your area in IT, lots of areas like that, is very, very difficult. At the end of the day, though, it is the standard that you're required to comply with. So the standard is, if there's new stuff that's come in since the standard, you're not required to incorporate that in your assessment. You might incorporate it in your teaching. You might bring that awareness of that to your students, that this software has now been replaced. But if the standard doesn't ask for that new software, but refers to older software or older procedures, then it's legitimate for you to stay with those older procedures for the purposes of certification.
One of the big issues is changes in legislation, where changes in legislation occur, but the industry skills councils can't keep up to date with the changes within the units of competency.
That's where I say what you do is you say to your class, I have to teach to these standards. These have now been superseded, but I have to teach to them. But then draw your attention to the fact that things have changed. So you might even find a person running a workshop who says this TAC document is now out of date. Now, it's still worth reading because most of it is still consistent, but draw your attention to the fact that some things have changed. So there's a difference there between the benchmark you use for making the judgment, which has to be, even if it's out of date, the standards. That's exactly where your judgment has to be. But when it comes to teaching, you can go beyond, as long as, but it can't be woven into the assessment. That would not be allowed. However, if the unit says compliance with current legislation, now it's current, and it's current at the time of assessment. So you've got to think about, you've got to look at the wording of the unit very carefully. But I've certainly seen a lot of examples of out-of-date assessment tools and materials and so on. In fact, one of the things that I still see from time to time is a lecturer who's using his own student notes as his lecture materials. And that is kind of scary. So that, you look at this clumsily written, handwritten notes from when they did their lectures, and now that's what they're teaching from. Yes?
A comment here. One of the conundrums we face as vet regulators is trying to make sense of all this. And one of the issues we have is when units of competency or qualifications are deemed equivalent, because in some cases, the equivalency is about the outcome in the workplace and may not necessarily mean that it contains the same units in terms of skills and knowledge. And this is why we say always map, because you might find that there are some additional assessment requirements, but the workplace outcome is the same.
Yeah,
so they will deem that unit equivalent.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult situation.
It is a very difficult one. It's useful, of course, if a person's using the old unit as a basis for a qualification, because it can then be counted as a unit in the qualification, within the qualification structure. But if you're going to award that unit, the new unit, and you're using materials or resources from the old unit, then you have to do the mapping, because there could be significant changes, particularly if they've gone from the old format to the new. Because in the old format didn't have performance evidence, for example. So the new ones do. And the performance evidence might be like required skills, or they might not be like required skills. So you'll often find that although functionally, as Poku was saying, in the workplace they are equivalent, that is, you couldn't really tell the difference between these two people in the way they work, in terms of what you've certificated, there could be a very big difference. In which case I'm just dealing that with another RTO at the moment, where they've used the word credit transfer to mean that they are simply going to say, oh, well, you've done a unit like it, we'll give you this unit. No, the answer is that's really got to be RPL, because the unit wasn't delivered by an RTO. It was probably at a higher education or something, not operating under the same regime, 50% pass sort of rule, those sorts of conditions. Straight away, you cannot extrapolate from the old to the new. So you really do have to have, if in doubt, map. Yes. No, I beg your pardon, I really ought to say, even if you are not in doubt, map. Yes.
Russell, I'm just going to bring it back to the activity, sorry. And I've got a point from online, if you'd like,
yes.
from us.
Thank you.
So they've looked at number 26, which was numerical adjustment and 50% pass. And Marie Anderson said, one that she has seen has been in Certificate 2 and Certificate 3 of Electrotechnology. Assessors insist
Hang
that
on, can I crawl under a table while you say that?
that insists that industry demands percentages, and because of the capstone test, all units of competency are assessed in the same way. In fact, 70% was the pass mark in knowledge assessments.
Yes, and that is simply. So I mean, if we were to observe such a thing happening, we would say that for the purposes of certification in the vet sector, 100% is required. If there's any other kind of function being serviced that allows something else, then less than 100% might be acceptable. I'll give you a good example. In license for operating a mobile crane, and forgive me, I might be using the wrong language here. WorkSafe standard, WorkSafe assessment said listed or asked the student to list hazards, and there were 12 hazards, and for the WorkSafe certificate you only had to get 8, but for the competency standard you had to get 12. Now one of them might be operating overhead power lines. You wouldn't have to get that right if you were doing it through WorkSafe, but you would have to get it right for certification. So there might be other people who are happy with percentages. Fine. When you report to them, you can report percentages. But when you make a judgment within the context of the vet sector, percentages are absolutely verboten because we're not accepting that. And I've often said, you know, I mean, the medical school at UWA prides itself in having an 80% pass mark. And I've often said, you know, when you're being wheeled in the gurney into the operating theatre and the doctor says, don't worry, I'm looking after you, I'm here, say to the doctor, could you tell me which 20% you don't know? And is there someone else in the operating theatre who does know that 20%? Because 20% wrong is not acceptable to me. And it shouldn't be acceptable to people in electrotechnology either. I can't afford to have an electrician who gets a 50% or even a 70% or even a 90% mark. That's not good enough for me. I expect my electricians to be 100%.
Sorry, when you're looking at a 70% pass mark, that might be in a test on paper. They get 70%. They move on, and then that can then get picked up in practical assessment. Can get picked up with questioning.
It could be. So, it could be. Yeah. If you can, but then it's no longer 70%. What you're saying is, I have identified in my judgment process that there's a deficit here, and more evidence is required, and you do supplementary assessment. But you keep doing supplementary assessment until either you run out of patience and time, or the person demonstrates the balance of the evidence. So, I mean, we're not talking about percentage pass. We're simply saying that part of the process is one of demonstrating a body of expertise or knowledge, and that can be supplemented. But you're not going to say 70% is near enough, good enough. I mean, we won't accept that within the vet sector. So that when something is listed in a unit of competency, it is not negotiable, it is mandatory. That the person demonstrates it. All the skills, all the performance criteria, all the not performance evidence, and all the knowledge evidence. And anything less than all is not yet competent. Now, if another organisation has another view, it's welcome, but not within the context of our certification, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
In regard to the percentages and things of a similar nature, when I first started in TAFE, we had percentages. We had A, Bs and Cs. And employers, if they had to pick between two students they wanted to employ, would often look at those measures as a way of quantifying who was better. Now that we have competency-based training, and I've got no problem with that as an assessment system, it's the employers who are having the difficulty trying to distinguish between two people. In the same way, we've had experience with universities who said, we want percentages so we can choose which students we want from your sector, instead of you telling us that they're all competent. So even though competency-based training is supposed to achieve a certain thing in industry, when it comes to people who are making judgments in the workplace or in higher education, they're the people who are having difficulty and require some way of knowing what distinguishes one person from another person when they've got the same qualification.
I don't have any problem with that, but my argument would be, well, okay, go for it, but not through our system. So fundamentally, if an employer wants to make a distinction between these 4 candidates for a job who are all competent, I don't have to ask the question, are these people competent? Yes, they are. So maybe I want the best team player. So I'll challenge test them, or I might sort of look to put these 4 people on probation and find out who's the best team player. I mean, if I have other criteria other than competence, that's for me. I can't delegate that to the vet sector to resolve that. So I will select you on the. I don't have to ask who is more competent. All I have to ask is which person fits the pattern or profile I want. If higher education says we want to have marks, fine, give them marks, but that doesn't impact on your judgment of competence. But I will say one more thing. We do have a grading system in the AQF. It's called Certificate 1, Certificate 2, Certificate 3, Certificate 4. If a person's achieving above their certificate level, then they're possibly demonstrating qualities of the next level of that competency. If they are, why not start adding those attributes to a record of their performance at the next level? What you could actually find is a person enrolled in a Certificate 3 unit, and you say, oh, look, I could give you a distinction in this, or better still, I can give you the Certificate 4 unit because you've actually demonstrated this unit to a higher level. And likewise, you could have a student enrolled in the Certificate 3 unit, and you might say to them, look, you haven't made the grade, but your evidence precisely matches this Certificate 2 unit. So I won't fail you, I'll give you a Certificate 2 unit. So we have a grading system, but instead of being just A, B, C, no one knows what they mean. What it does is say, this is your level of performance. So the function of competency-based assessment and the AQF is to describe what a person can do. And that is really a significant step, because an A doesn't tell you what a person can do. It just means that they can, I mean, as we'll see soon with the judgment exercise they're going to get you to do, you could get a person who gets a lower mark, performs on more important criteria, and is therefore the better performer. I mean, you know, so you might have a situation where high marks don't necessarily mean good performance because there are gaps in their performance. It's a bit like saying, you know, you're 95% well, but your heart is shot. But you get 95%. So go home and relax, play sport, run around. The 5% that's shot is the really critical 5%. So saying a person's got 80%, it really does matter which 20% is missing. It could be 20% trivial stuff, and it could be 20% crucial stuff. And I could have 2 people who got 50%. I could have could both have got 50%, but they could have got the exact opposite 50% to each other, and therefore be completely unalike. And yet, as an employer, I would say you were the same, because you both got 50%. And you can see how the numbers absolutely create a kind of fiction, a kind of an unreality, because both get 50%, they're the same. No, they're not. They're exact opposites of each other. So you can see the numbers don't tell you anything. And it's one of the reasons we've gone competency-based, because numbers and numerical systems, for a start, how do you know that this question's worth 1 mark? Why is it not worth 2 or 1.3 or 0.7 of a mark? We have no idea what a question's worth. And some questions are not worth anything, in the sense that without that performance, you'd be totally dysfunctional. So it's a bit like saying, well, how many marks would you give the wheels on a car? How many marks do you give the doors on a car? I mean, well, the truth is that these things have different values and different functional meanings. And that's why we've gone competency-based, because the mark system utterly failed to tell employers anything useful. And they'd end up employing people who get the high grades and were dead useless in the job because they were maybe very good at reciting back information but couldn't think to save themselves. Because high marks is not an indicator of performance. Don't talk about that in the context of Year 12. These poor blighters are out there doing stuff and they might as well toss a coin in a pond, because the truth is that the marks that they get in Year 12 are rubbish. And if you've got a Year 12 student, I feel for you, because the marking system used for Year 12 is absolute rubbish. It's not even just rubbish, it's absolute rubbish. And yet, whole futures are determined on the basis of those marks. If you fall 1 mark below a cutoff, you won't get in. Your whole future life and career is affected by that. And these marks are an absolute fiction. They mean nothing. But we've had this quaint faith in them. We've known that they mean nothing now for at least 40 years. I was on the Board of Secondary Education and we knew that they meant nothing. I was on the Secondary Education Authority and we knew that they were nothing. But it's what people believe in. It's a kind of act of faith. So we in the vet sector, we said enough, enough, enough. We're going to get rid of this concept of marking. We're going to, and the TAFE sector found it very difficult to deal with because I've overtalked you. I'm sorry, Stephen. But fundamentally, it is one of the things which we've had to abandon very, very quickly, and yet it is one of the things that most people found most difficult to deal with. So it is. I can direct, if anyone is interested in this topic, I can direct you to some very interesting papers on this issue. And we tried all sorts of things. There was a report done, not a report, but a book published in about 1950 which said that the marking systems used, this is an American book, across the world were just rubbish because we're not dealing with interval scales. We don't know if the numbers actually relate to any kind of meaningful quality. I mean, NAPLAN, or NAPALM as I prefer to call it, is a fine example of that. It produces rubbish information, damaging information. It's a research tool, not a teaching tool. It could be used in research in a meaningful way, dealing with global figures, but to deal with it as if the number assigned to an individual had actual meaning is just downright wrong. And yet that's what schools do, that's what teachers do, that's what parents do. And the numbers assigned to an individual through NAPLAN is meaningless. I mean, it's not even an approximation. You can't even talk about errors around it because these numbers are not measures like the measures on a ruler or the measures on a scale, weighing scale. These numbers are in actual fact artifacts. They might as well be letters of the alphabet because they're not actual numbers. What you have to have is what's called a ratio or interval scale. And numbers, things like weight or height, they are ratio scales and interval scales. Half my height, double that and you get my height. It works on ratios. And I can measure my height using a ruler and I will get consistent results because every centimetre on that ruler is the same size. But when you measure my intellect or my performance with a ruler, the gaps between the numbers are not equal. So I could be 5 tall because you measure me with 5 big intervals, with 5 big questions, or I could be 50 tall because you've measured me with 10 little ones. What I'm getting at here is that we don't have in measurement in education and training the same kind of thing as we have in measurement of physics or building. And so we have this serious problem that we have leapt from the psychometric world into the education and training world. And even in psychometrics, the numbers are artifacts. So we have a serious problem, and it is enshrined in ACR, NAPLAN, Year 12 assessments, They continue on year after year. Every year we complain about them as being useless, and every year, and vast numbers of students fail first year university because the numbers were not meaningful, simply not meaningful. And so, you know, if we had that sort of failure rate in building or in transport, I mean, if over a third of every building fell down, if a third of your truck drivers couldn't drive trucks, I mean, you'd be out of business in a flash. But not in education. We can have that sort of error. The standard error of measurement within the context of, say, written tests, which is primarily what's used in year 12, the standard error of measurement is around about 60%. That means a person who gets 30% might have got 90%. It's just as likely. So that sort of width of error is just intolerable. But because it's a number, we believe it. And we are prepared to add it to another unbelievable number to get an aggregate unbelievable number. And then we divide by the number we first thought of. It just is bizarre. And in the late 1980s, we decided in the vet sector, enough is enough. We're not going to do that anymore. Education tried to do it and failed. As you might remember, there was outcomes-based education and the West Australian hammered it to death, and it failed for all sorts of reasons, but not the least of which is you can't introduce these changes unless you put your people through professional development. And they were trying to introduce these changes into the education sector without any teacher training, without any professional development. And they kept the two systems running in parallel, and they do not operate in parallel. It's a bit like, you know, the two different software systems just don't operate. You have one or you have the other, but you can't run both. And so it crashed in the education world. But in the vet sector, we did it. And this doesn't mean it's flawless, but it's a long way better. But what we have to do now is to focus on the fact that we use the AQF as our grading system. And so if we want to recognise higher performance, we don't do so with a bigger number or with a letter of the alphabet or with a word like distinction and high distinction. We actually do it through recognition of high levels of performance in the AQF. I first struck this when I became a university tutor, and I was tutoring in educational measurement, would you believe? A bit spooky. And as a tutor, I had marked all my students' work. And then I said to my lecturer, the senior lecturer who was running the course, well, how do I allocate distinctions and high distinctions and credits? And he said, oh, the top 5% get the high distinctions. And then the next 10% get distinctions, and so on. So I was drawing lines. I said, but how do I know that this top 5% is actually distinction level? And the answer is that's it, 5% is high distinction. So, you know, if you have a dumb class, it doesn't matter, 5% will still get high distinctions. Have a really genuinely bright class, and no matter how good they are, 5% will get distinctions, high distinctions. So, I mean, it was just rubbish. And here I am running an educational measurement course, and I'm looking at it thinking, good God, this is just rubbish. So I started teaching that at Murdoch, and at Murdoch, one of my students said to me, if it's all rubbish, why are you doing it? That's a terrible thing to say to a lecturer. And so I said, right, well, we will go outcomes-based. And I redesigned the course to be competency-based. Well, we didn't use the word competencies in those days. We talked about them as outcomes. All of a sudden, my students knew what it took to get a high distinction. And my students would slave away and get high distinctions. And then the university academic board said, your standards have dropped. Everyone's getting high distinctions. And I had to say, but the reason they're getting high distinctions is they now know what it is to be highly distinguished. And they are putting the effort in and achieving that level. So when I started working at Edith Cowan, I said to them, you want me to run a course on competency-based assessment? Fine, only if you let me run it as a competency-based assessment process. In which case your percentages for A's, B's, C's and D's out the window. If all my students get A's, then they all get A's. And if they all fail, they all fail. I mean, even at university like Curtin, if you fail too many students, the administration will pass more students so that your because your failure rate is determined by percentages, not by performance. And so it's really spooky, this sort of belief in numbers, whereas we believe in standards. We believe in absolutely that you can define what it is to be competent. And when a person demonstrates those qualities of what it is to be competent, then we can award them the competency. So it's a profoundly different game. So when we come to making the judgment, that was a long aside, but you can see it's rather dear to my heart, but it is also very pertinent to the challenge. And the reference being made on a number of occasions today about outside forces saying we want percentages, that's fine because that's what other people expect. But you must not let that interfere with your judgment or what you assess. You can add, you can say to them, well, if you have other grounds for making a judgment, please tell us about them and we will, as an aside, do that assessment for you. But we will not let that interfere with our judgment of what it is to be competent. And that is, of course, important for your status as an RTO. So making the judgment is the critical thing. And I might say, you see, the lovely thing about marks is the judgment is easy. You got 50%, you're a pass. Whoa, I don't have to make any kind of judgment. I don't have to ask, is that a good 50%? I don't have to ask anything at all. You got the 50%, pass. So beautiful. I don't have to make a judgment. I don't have to really ask the question, is this person worth a pass? Or is this person worth a distinction? I just have to say, you got the marks, you get the grade. In our game, it's much more complicated than that. So what we are going to look at is this, what I would regard as the supreme role of the qualified assessor. And I say qualified assessor because that's what you guys are. To be able to carry this off, to be able to carry off the concept of, so every second table with those things, yeah. To be able to carry off this task of making a judgment, you need to be highly qualified. In other sectors, you don't have to be highly qualified as an assessor, because all you have to do is produce a kind of mystical thing called numbers, marks, and on the basis of those mystical marks, you can. No, this is my table. We might have end up with a bit of asymmetry here, Pocket, but never mind. You'll have a piece of paper here which is either got the name of A blogs or B blogs. You can assign. Everyone got? Yep. So there's A blogs and B blogs tables. And I've given you the results here, an assessment record, and this is one that I've derived, not derived from actual practice because I wouldn't breach confidentiality in that way, but it looks very much like the sort of thing I see in a lot of RTOs. So the unit of competency is contribute to assessment, and if you want, you've got your own copy of the contribute to assessment standards. Those online, we're looking at the piece of paper called assessment record, which is the simple page, which just has assessment, performance assessment 1, 2, and 3. It's not the matrix page, which you'll find is in another document, and this group is going to see a bit later on. But we've just handed out, you might have both A blogs and B blogs. You can look at A or B, it doesn't matter which one. So we don't have the evidence gathering tools. What I want you to do is to look at this information here and decide whether or not A blogs or B blogs is competent or not. I've made a result here that they're not satisfactory with performance assessment 1. I'm looking at A blogs. I don't know where's B blogs. Is B blogs? We've got a B blogs page. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so B blogs and A blogs are not satisfactory with performance assessment 1, and you can see the number of criteria that they've met. Thanks very much. So what I want you to do is to just make a decision as to whether or not you think A blogs or B blogs is competent. Yes.
Is there rules for the assessment tool that says it has to be 100% on all questions?
Yes.
So it's 100% all the way.
All criteria have to be met. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
In the case of assessment 1, was the student allowed a reassessment?
No. This is the final result after any reassessments.
All assessments.
This decision is being made that blogs A and blogs B have had a chance to do any supplementary assessments, anything of that kind. You might decide that further assessment or further action might be required, but I want you to make a decision on the basis of this evidence as to whether A blogs or B blogs is competent or not. Okay, let's have a look at A blogs. Who are the A blogs tables? Okay, anybody, first of all, there are no prerequisites, by the way. If you had a look at the document, you would have found no prerequisites. But we draw attention to the fact that if there were prerequisites, they would have to be shown as competent or as completed or as evidenced. But if you look at the actual unit of competency, you'll see that there are no prerequisites for this unit. So A blogs, is A blogs competent? Anybody want to say competent for A blogs? Everybody saying not yet competent? Absolutely. And if you add up those criteria, they've got 47 out of 61 criteria, or 77% of the criteria. So they're a little bit below the medical requirements and a bit above other marking requirements. Let's have a look at B blogs. Does anyone think B blogs is competent? No? Okay, he's not competent. But he got 82% of the criteria. So if he was a medical student, he would have passed. Now, this all looks okay. Let's have a little look. We'll come have a look at them, because what I want to show you in a minute is their actual patterns of performance. Because you'll discover something when you look at the actual patterns of performance that's not evident on those pages. But I think everybody agrees that on the basis of this evidence, neither blog, A and brother B, is competent. If we now look at, and I'm going to just jump a little bit ahead because I think it's relevant to do so, at their detailed records, we end up with a different story. You A or you B? B. You're B, okay. Here are the detailed records of A blogs and B blogs across all of the assessment tools. Can't separate that. Never mind. You're going to get. Oh, there we go. Thank you. The spare one. Oh, that's why. That's why I couldn't do it. It was resisting. You're B. No, A. I mean A. Good. Okay. Is A. Okay. Where A is here. Now, A blogs and B blogs. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. A blogs and B blogs. Now I've given you detailed matrices, and you might recall, if you've been to one of my previous workshops, that we talked about doing a mapping. So you can see that what's here is behind the scenes is a mapping. The outcomes of a previous discussion when we looked at designing assessment tools, and prior to that when we looked at assessment systems, we talked about building a mapping of the relationship between the assessment tools and the unit requirements. So you see the unit requirements down the left-hand side of the page, and then you see with ticks and crosses how A blogs or B blogs has performed relative to those requirements. What you discover, you also see on the second page, there's an awful lot of information such as performance assessment 1, forklift, performance assessment 2, mobile crane, performance assessment 3, rigging. I have no idea. These are not courses in forklift, mobile crane and rigging, but demonstration of a person who is assisting, participating in assessments of forklift, mobile crane and rigging. So don't get too worried about the context. What it's saying is that as it says in the standards, you must demonstrate your ability to participate in assessment across a range of different contexts. So the purpose of that bit of performance assessment 1, 2 and 3 is to show that A blogs and B blogs have not just participated in the same assessment 3 times, but have participated in 3 different assessments. The first assessment they were participating in as an observer or as a contributor to the assessment was in forklift, and the second was in mobile crane, and the third was in rigging. And that's just simply saying that, but the assessment isn't about forklift rigging, it's about contribute to assessment. So what you see now is something interesting that's happening. First of all, PA1, PA2 and PA3 overlap. So it's not just a question of adding things together. And what I'd like you to do is to make a decision about A blogs and B blogs and decide on the basis of this evidence as to whether or not they are competent. Now, I'm not expecting you to just be able to do this straight off, but have a go, and then I'll walk you through. And those of you online, you can do both A blogs and B blogs if you like, or just one or the other. But have a go and say, on the basis of this evidence, are they competent?
So was PA1 carried out first, PA2 second?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that would be the case. Yeah. No. Yeah. So PA1 would be first, PA2 second, PA3 third, and then KA is knowledge assessment. How are we going? Are we getting there? What's your, who have you got? B or A? B?
I'm looking at the knowledge evidence first.
Yep.
There's been supplementary questions thrown where the 2 are wrong, where they're obviously assessed against oral questioning against that. So the dean, they got it wrong in the first place, asked it again in a different way, and they got it right the second time. So they've used other methods to confirm whether.
Yeah, so you could tick that right-hand column, couldn't you, all the way down? Because, yeah. So all the knowledge has been demonstrated. Yep.
They had other forms of confirmation.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah. So how's he going? How's blogs going?
Well, at the moment, knowledge-wise,
Okay, fair enough. I've just realised what you'd have to call a logistical problem, and that is when I'm talking about A blogs, the B blogs people won't know what I'm talking about. So I better give the B blogs people. So have you got A blogs there in your hand? You got A blog or B blogs? If I give you A blogs, I'll get you to handle them out. Okay, but we'll just wait a second. Yeah, no, we'll just wait a second. But this is a B blogs. This is the first A blogs table here. So,
but I'll give it to the B blogs people.
Yeah, give it to the B blogs, but we don't want them to look. Yeah, not just yet. Wait until Pock, you'll wait until I start talking. Okay, folks, could I have a show of hands? How many people think A blogs is competent? A blogs is competent. You think A blogs is competent? Okay. No. You're doing B? Yeah, beg your pardon. How many people think that B blogs is competent? B blogs. Okay, so we've got some B blogs coming up competent. Now, this is despite the fact that before we found B blogs to be not competent. Anybody finding A blogs to be competent? Let's have a look at these in some detail. I'm going to ask Pokua now to give all the B blogs people the A blogs page so that you can see what's going on. If we look at A blogs, we can start off by looking at element 1, and I think we've run out of them now. We're short a bit. Probably because I told you I only needed half as many. I'm sorry. If we look at A blogs, you can see with element 1 that in PA1 he got every part of element 1 wrong. Okay, you can see that stack of crosses. But then he got all of element 1 right the second time and all of element 1 right the third time. So we've seen element 1 twice. We can say, yes, he's achieved element 1 because we've seen it twice. Let's have a look at element 2.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
In the rules of engagement, does it state that they have to have at least 2 forms of assessment to be deemed competent?
It does. In actual fact, it doesn't say that, no, but I'm putting that in myself. And technically speaking, it probably says you only need to have 1, but I'm putting in 2 because consistency is in the definition of a unit of competency. Yeah. If I look at element 2, I find that he didn't get it in PA1, he didn't get it in PA2, he did get it in PA3. That's just one shot. I'm not seeing consistency of performance, so I'm going to have to say no to element 2. If I look at element 3, I have to say no because, once again, I've only seen it once. Notice that although he got in PA1 and PA2, he did actually demonstrate both performance criteria. He didn't demonstrate them both at one time, and therefore it doesn't count. So that's no. So it's a yes, no, no so far down the outcome column. Then if I look at element 4, I find that he has demonstrated all 3 criteria twice, and therefore I can tick element 4. So he has demonstrated element 1 and element 4, but he hasn't now demonstrated element 2 or element 3. So he's straight away we can see he's not going to make competency. If we go down to the performance evidence, now when it comes to performance evidence, you don't need to see it twice because they're not elements of competency. So I have seen every one of performance evidence once, twice, and 3, but it specifies that performance evidence 4 has to be seen 3 times, and that's the only time it mentions it, and so it's only been seen twice, so that's a cross. So it's tick, 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 cross for the performance evidence. Now we look at his knowledge, and he's a winner when it comes to knowledge. This guy's got his brain around the subject matter, and so it's a yes all the way down for knowledge. So we have to say at the end of the day that he's missed out on 2 elements and 1 performance evidence. He is not yet competent.
So tell me he's a university student who's got a part-time job over the weekend, had to get his corporate ticket, failed his practical but is able to obtain his theory.
Ah, yes, you've met him already. Yeah. Now let's have a look at Mr. Blogs B, because in Blogs B we had some weird people suggesting he might be competent. Let's see if he is. Have you got copies of Blogs B coming? Blogs B is coming. Yep. No, I think I might have one more B. No, that's a B blogs. If you look at blogs B, you discover that he's achieved element 1 because we see it in PA2 and PA3. He's achieved element 2 because we've seen it in PA1 and PA3. He's achieved element 3 because we've seen it in PA1 and PA2. And he's achieved element 4 because we've seen it in PA2 and PA3. He's achieved all of the performance evidence. And he actually has achieved all the knowledge, although he had to have a couple of goes. For example, one bit of knowledge I picked up from another unit, because if the same bit of knowledge is involved and I've seen it in another unit, I can use that as evidence. And also for the 6th bit of evidence, I used some oral questioning and managed to establish that, a challenge test, if you like, and managed to establish. So he has the knowledge. So he has all the elements and all the knowledge. He is competent. Now, you can see that this led to B blogs getting his certificate, whereas if I'd used the other method, B blogs wouldn't have. And it's because the numbers, the 6 out of 10 or the 17 out of 20, they hide the detail. And they hide the fact that there is overlapping evidence here. that the numbers don't count because some of the numbers are duplicates of each other. So what matters with B blogs is the pattern of his performance, not just the sum total, but the pattern. And his pattern of performance led to competence, whereas A blogs' pattern of performance didn't. And the funny thing about it is that they differ very marginally. B blogs has a total of 82%, and B blogs has a total of 77%. Very small difference in percentage, but the pattern of performance was different, significantly different. So the end result is significantly different. You can see also that this is a defendable decision. That on the other document, I can't defend my decision. But on this one, I can defend my decision. I've done an analysis of the pattern of the blogses, and as a consequence of an analysis of the pattern, I can make a reasoned, analytically based judgment of competency. And that's a very big difference. Yes, Sarah?
Yeah, just on the performance evidence, I was just going through the assessment requirements, and in the performance evidence, it did say carry out a minimum of 3 evidence gathering activities on each occasion.
Yeah.
Now, in this one, he's been marked 2 of those elements. He had a cross on the first time round. That's kind of where.
No, but it doesn't actually say that he has to achieve 3. He has to carry out 3.
Okay.
And so you need to be thinking about the language. However, when it came to the report findings, when it came to reporting findings, that was quite different because you had to actually report findings. The report findings down here
3 times,
is on each of 3 occasions.
Yeah.
So that has a different status. You've got to read the wording fairly carefully, and that's the part of the trick. And of course, I might be assigning too much cleverness to the writers of the unit. They may not have meant that at all. But I have to be able to defend that I've made a good judgment. But what I want you to see from this is those 2 different things. That firstly, the lumpy method of saying, has he passed each activity, gives you only a very crude indicator of competence. Getting it to this level gives you a precise one. Yes?
Can you please clarify for me the use of evidence from another unit?
Okay.
How and when one can do that?
When it is either exactly the same element or exactly the same knowledge, then you can. So, for example, in the case of the TAE, the knowledge base is, almost every unit talks about the rules of evidence or the principles of assessment. You don't have to measure them again and again and again and again. And indeed, when the IBSA, which no longer is involved in this, but when it used to run this, design its own assessment tools, it had an omnibus knowledge assessment, which covered all the knowledge. And then you could just write it into the relative units from that knowledge test. Now, there is a circumstance where the unit elements can be the same, but they're not really the same. So, for example, if you're looking at, I can't be sure of the actual whether it's exactly right, but say use a non-skid, a skid steer loader and a forklift and so on. The first element is to do your pre-operational checks, and they are word for word the same for every unit. But they're not the same because there's a different bit of equipment, and therefore the pre-operational checklist used for one is not the same as a pre-operational checklist used for the other. So it has the illusion of being the same element when it's not. So you'd actually have to ask yourself, I could actually transfer evidence from an element to another element if it was exactly the same element. Now, I can't do that at performance criterion level because performance criterion level, the performance criteria do not exist as separate entities. I can't say if I was measuring this room and I said, do I have any black paper? Well, I do have I have the black here and I have the paper here, therefore I have black paper. The performance evidence has to be, the paper has to be black. In other words, the performance criteria do not exist as separate things. They exist only as part of the element. So I can't say I saw this performance criterion here, and I saw that performance criterion here, and I saw this one here. I add them all up, and I've got myself. It's a bit like making a cake and leaving the sugar out and saying, oh, well, here's a slice of cake, and here's a cup of sugar. Enjoy. Yeah.
Trucks tipping the cab for doing more engine and everything else, so they could be transferred from one vehicle to another because the same inspectionist would be used.
Yeah. Okay.
Would that be correct, sir?
If you know it's the same, then you can do it. But if it's going to be different, then you can't. Now that's on an element basis or a knowledge item basis or even a performance evidence basis. So that interchange is possible, and that's because we're talking competencies. We couldn't do that if they were marks, but we can do them if they're competencies, which leads us to the idea of flexibility. You can see how I can be fair and I can be flexible if I'm using this system. I can't be fair and flexible if I'm using the other system because I have no idea what satisfactory and unsatisfactory means. Unsatisfactory is a broad brush statement which says, well, you didn't achieve everything, but it doesn't tell you what was achieved. So there's no acknowledgement in the word unsatisfactory that the person has in fact demonstrated a lot of qualities. We've really done that bit. So the first thing we can do with this is allow for unplanned evidence. So fundamentally, if I see a bit of evidence, I'm happy to walking down the street and Mary demonstrates some extraordinary. I'm having a chat with Mary at the corner, and Mary starts talking about the course and reveals some profound understanding. I don't have to say, oh, well, Mary hasn't got it. I can go back to the office and tick that box because Mary has revealed in her conversation with me. It is serendipitous evidence. I don't have to say to Mary, oh, well, it was all very well that you told me that, but I have to assess you. That was evidence. So there's a lot of serendipitous or unplanned evidence that comes in. And you as assessors, as competent, qualified people, when you recognise a bit of pertinent evidence, you can take it as evidence and pop it into your record. All of a sudden, a person's record begins to fill, not because they've done lots of assessment, but because you've been an observant assessor. You need, before you put a tick in this box, you need to ask yourself the question, is this evidence I can accept? So you must evaluate the quality of each item of evidence. Has PA1 been done properly? Has PA2 been done properly? If not, then I can't accept it as evidence and I will eliminate it from my record. So every tick or cross in here has to be, you have to ask the question, can I accept that? And what do I use to judge if it's good evidence? The rules of evidence. Is it valid evidence? Is it authentic evidence? Is it current evidence? Is there going to be sufficiency when I put all this evidence together? So you can see that fundamentally, I don't put a tick or a cross in here until I'm comfortable with the evidence. Until then, it's a question mark. I collate the credible evidence, and that's what I've done here on this two sides of paper. And this is not unreasonable. Almost every unit, I've never seen a unit that takes more than 2 pages of 2 sides of paper. Map the evidence onto the unit requirements. And that's what we've done here. We've mapped the evidence into the unit. I might say that some bit of evidence, and somebody asked before about the evidence coming from another unit. You did. I mean, it could have been a clustered unit. It could be a cluster of units, in which case the same evidence might write across to more than one unit because we've clustered them deliberately because of the overlap between them. And I don't want to duplicate the assessment. So fundamentally, if I'm clustering, this is beautiful. Have one record per unit, but PA1 or whatever it is might contribute to 1, 2 or 3 units. And that would be beautiful. Save a lot of time. I gather any supplementary evidence, as you saw here, where a bit of supplementary evidence of knowledge was gathered. But what I basically do is I ask myself the question when I've mapped it, well, where are the gaps? I mean, where is blogs having trouble? I can then actually say to blogs, look, I need more evidence in this area, and blogs can go out and cheat by deliberately becoming competent. And we wouldn't mind that in the least. In other words, just simply say, instead of saying to them simply, oh, you're not satisfactory on PA1, we can say, where your problem with PA1 is, and we can actually point out what is missing. So you can see it becomes a much better supplementary assessment tool. It becomes a much better guidance tool to the student. But notice also that whatever else Blogs has done, Blogs might have worn a suit that day, or Blogs might have been wearing something outlandish. I'm not affected by that because what he wears is not on this list. So straight away, I'm focusing on what matters to be competent. I'm not being distracted by other kinds of things that might bother me. I mean, I hope you wouldn't be bothered by what he wore, but the point about it is that this provides you with a clear focus so that you can attend to the things that matter. And then you can make the final assessment judgment, and that's what you've done with this. And I take my hat off to those of you who judged Blogs to be competent, that is Blogs B Blogs, because I think you've made the right decision. And you can see that with that extra data, you can make a much more meaningful and valid and defensible judgment. And that is really where we're going. Now, that is interesting, though, because that mapping is just the mapping that was done to create and validate the tools. In other words, you haven't had to create something new. You've just used something that you've already done. But now, instead of just validating the tools, it becomes a record and it becomes a judgment tool. So here you've got fabulous synergy between the development process, the evidence gathering process, the judgment process, and then the record keeping, which is where we're going next. Yeah.
I just want to say the mapping that's done here, most people don't know how to do it. This is something
why we're
that,
running a workshop.
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't understand this. My peers here didn't understand this properly. So I worked with them through it. Yeah. So it's a hard one for people to create that if they don't.
I agree, and I don't know if other people have been to the previous workshops, but the previous workshops we built these in the previous workshops. It's not. You'll also find in the assessment fact sheet that it talks about the construction of these mapping tools. And what it is, I'll get to you to tick, thank you very much, but what it does basically do, I mean, you can see what's happening here, that fundamentally we have all the criteria down the left-hand side. Next time when we meet, we talk about validation. That's the first step of validation. Have I read the blooming unit validly? And that brings into play those questions about where does the 3 come in? I mean, so you're going to have to, and you may have to do a little bit of discussion with your colleagues, but if the unit's being well written, and I use the word if quite carefully, then it should be clear what should be written down the left-hand side. Then across the page, you map your different evidence gathering tools, either ones that you've purchased or ones you've created. And you're asking yourself the question, where am I getting evidence for each of these qualities? When it comes to elements, you need to get evidence at least twice, because the elements of competency need to be demonstrated consistently, range of context, over a period of time, and so on. Performance evidence usually is satisfactory to see once, and knowledge, it's satisfactory to see once. And it takes us back, I might say, to a very early question, which is being inundated with paper. The purpose of this really is to enable you to get so focused that you have the minimum number of assessment tools to get the maximum amount of evidence, that all of that evidence meets the rules of evidence, and then provides a solid basis for making a judgment, notwithstanding the fact that you might also get evidence in other ways. So this document, not that one, this document is also your RPL tool, because you can basically say, well, what am I learning from RPL evidence? So you might have PA1, but PA2 might be evidence that the person's presented. You're not likely to, because of authenticity and currency, rely on everything that they've brought in their wheelbarrow of evidence. You probably have to challenge test, if I can use that word. I know it's foreign to you, Marcus, but you may need a challenge test in order to substantiate that the evidence they provided you from the past is both current and authentic. But having established the authenticity and currency of that evidence, you can then accept it, and then you've got the basis for making an RPL judgment. And isn't this beautiful? Because it means RPL is not a soft option. It has the same rigor and precision as standard assessment, and that is a beautiful thing about it. So this becomes, there's a question, yes, thank you, I'm
Yep.
sorry.
So this is quite a long question from Teresa
Should
at
I sit
Central
down,
Regional
Teresa?
Possibly. Russell, I'm really confused now. Why have you called performance assessment a tool? I would have thought it was an instrument. So then several instruments using different methods come together to form an assessment tool that addresses a whole unit of competency, as well as an assessment plan, mapping, decision-making criteria, competency decisions. Can you please explain if an assessment tool must address a whole unit of competency? Or can an assessment tool be used interchangeably with an assessment method? There are some of the blurry issues with assessment terminology, tools, method, instruments, approaches, etc. Are just some examples of terms that have been used interchangeably for years, even in formal government publications and by regulatory authorities, thus creating confusion, uncertainty, and a loss of confidence in assessment practices across the board. There are very specific differences between these terms, and fortunately, the TAE ASS 502 makes some attempt to differentiate between these key terms. Clarification is essential if we are to use the language of assessment consistently.
Very good. It's a good question because language does come into this game a lot of the time. The way I'm using the language is that I have a unit of competency which has a whole bunch of requirements. I need a suite of assessment tools which together make up my assessment process for that unit. That suite of assessment tools would be some knowledge assessment, a knowledge assessment tool, a performance assessment tool, probably more than one performance assessment tool. It might be a third-party performance assessment tool. So I'm simply using the word assessment tool, and certainly this is the way we used it in the previous workshop, to mean a single document or a document that measures some or all of the unit's requirements. It is not necessary for one assessment tool to measure all the requirements of a unit for two reasons. One is that, well, clearly knowledge assessment tool only measures the knowledge component. And as we stressed last time, you can't measure skill with a knowledge test. There are going to be clearly a second a second assessment tool, which will be your performance assessment tool, because it's going to be measuring skills. It would normally be the skills component of a unit are normally the elements and the performance evidence, and they do not measure knowledge because a person can perform a skill or a task without the knowledge. The other point about it too is that, going back to Grant's situation, and that is, you may only see the performance with a particular kind of maritime craft, but you can measure knowledge across the board. So you can basically say, well, I want to see you, dare I use that word again, docking this vessel, birthing, but I feel a bit uncomfortable as a man talking about birthing. We're back outside looking at my plumbing again. The thing about it is that I can only see it being done because that's the only vessel I've got. But now I can say to you, now, how would this be different if this was a different vessel? How would this be different if it had side thrusters or bow thrusters or something? I'm making it up. All right, okay, and so on. So that, you know, fundamentally, I would be able to ask that knowledge. So the knowledge lifts me out of the present into a range of contexts which are not available to me here physically. But the skills, which I hope are transferable, I can actually see, but they're naturally constrained. So, but then, if I am going to measure performance, I probably would want to see a person berthing or docking, or berthing docking, as my mother would call it, with two vessels. Because to see it with one vessel would be to say, well, you know how to work this really well. I trained you on it. You spent your life on it. But I'm going to give you a national certificate for any kind of vessel, maybe a vessel under 500 tons or something. But it might have a constraint on it, but it'll be a range of kinds of vessel. In which case, I would expect to see at least more than one kind of vessel. But I wouldn't need to see every kind of vessel because I can cover the extras through the knowledge component. So the issue is really, seeing the tool as a discrete document to measure knowledge or performance. Those are two different methods of assessment. So question and answer is one method, and observation of performance is another method. I might have one tool to measure knowledge, but if there's a lot of knowledge, I might have 2 or 3 knowledge tests, or 2 or 3 knowledge tools, if you like, because there might be so much knowledge that I can't meaningfully measure it in one go. I might even want to measure some of the knowledge before I start training to find out where they are, and measure the rest of the knowledge at the end. I might do, yes. That's an unusual word. Where did that come from? And so fundamentally, the tools are the structured documents we use to manage the gathering of evidence, by observation, by question and answer, whatever. The methods are what I've just said then, question and answer or observation. And we have a suite of tools which together enable us to cover everything that's required of the unit. But lying outside the tools, lying outside our plans, is still the possibility of accidental or serendipitous evidence when you run into Mary in the street and have a conversation with her. That sort of thing, and it does happen. And you will sometimes find a person can't do something in an assessment situation, partly maybe because of stress. And then you go out and you see them actually doing it in the real workplace and you say, well, hang on, you couldn't do that before. And they can do it, but somehow or other the contrived situation you created prevented them from being able to demonstrate it. And then you say, well, that's better evidence. The evidence that I'm getting now is the real deal. You go back and look at your assessment tools and say, for some reason or other, these are not faithfully reflecting the real world. So you use that discrepancy between what you're seeing in one situation to another as part of your validation. Oops, I've slipped into next time. Here's a question here.
We're still having, we've actually got quite a lively debate happening in the chat, which might surprise you all in this room. We're not quiet on chat. However, they're still concerned around...
Level out there.
Yeah. There's still some confusion with regards to the nomenclature instruments.
Instruments, basically an instrument is a tool. An instrument is a device that has an instrumental function, that is, it serves a purpose. So an assessment tool could be an assessment instrument. Each assessment tool or instrument leads ultimately to, utilizes a particular assessment method, such as observation or whatever. Look, I might, by the way, say that you could have an assessment instrument or an assessment tool that has within it some questioning components, in which case you could have an assessment tool that has actually got some knowledge questions in it. So I mean, but the tool is just the piece of paper which you use when you're gathering evidence. So it'll be an observation checklist, a question and answer checklist. So that's tool, instrument. Don't regard these as different meanings. And if you'll allow me, forgive me for saying this, don't look for meaning, subtleties of meaning that aren't there. It's just that we use these words interchangeably. They are not, in fact, different words. And you'll find, and the fact that they are used interchangeably in various publications is an illustration of the fact that we haven't settled on one phraseology. But an assessment tool, an assessment instrument, an assessment device, a test, these are all the same things. What defines them is not their word, but what they do. So let's just think about it in those terms. What is this tool, instrument, test? What does it do? Well, now, what it does is contribute to a record. And that record, so I've got to get the word record in somewhere, that record leads to you being able to make an analytical and defensible judgment of competency. So let's have a look now at keeping assessment records. I do want to stress here that the function of assessment records there are many different functions, and each function means that we need to keep different kinds of records. So one record is this, which is a record of student outcomes. It records what we've seen. It records the evidence that we've accepted. It doesn't record the evidence we haven't accepted because that is not evidence. and just vanishes into the ether. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of space. It isn't anything meaningful. So if a person performs, does a performance which does not stand up to the rules of evidence, then it is simply did not happen. It doesn't exist. So if I hit a hole in one when I'm playing golf, you don't know if it's authentic because I'm the only one who was there to see it. So it didn't happen. Unless the evidence can be authenticated, can be seen to be current, can be seen to be valid, can be seen to be sufficient, then it's not of itself evidence and doesn't appear on this record. So the first function of recording is student outcomes. And the second is to justify judgments. And when you're justifying judgments, it might be because there's an appeal. Now, the appeal is most likely to happen from A blogs rather than B blogs because A blogs is going to be judged not competent. And so fundamentally, I can defend my judgment with A blogs as not competent because I've got this record. And I can say, well, here it stands. One of my problems I had with a university lecturer in engineering at a university which won't be named was that he came to me really sad because many of his students that he'd failed had been passed by the administration during the Christmas holidays, probably some sort of Christmas gift. And he was very upset. And I said, well, you know, how can you defend your judgment that they truly were failures? And he had no evidence that would do that. I mean, he had the fact that they got less than 50%. But that is not evidence that a person's failed because they might have got 49 really important % of really important engineering principles. And the 51% that they lost might have been sort of trash or interesting facts or interesting asides, but not central or core to the world of engineering. Who knows? He couldn't defend it. If he had a record like this, he could say, no, this person really is a failure. This person really can't succeed. And so I said to him, he said, what can I do? And I said, what you've got to write out is a set of competencies that engineers need to have. And he did. I got him first to do an analysis of his assessments, and he came back to me ashen-faced and said, I'm just asking them to repeat my lectures. He said, that's not what engineers do. And I said, well, tell me what engineers do. And he started talking about all the skills and qualities that engineers need to have. And I said, that's what needs to be assessed. Why aren't you assessing all that stuff? So he was assessing the wrong stuff. It was a bit like the drunk who's crawling around under a streetlight trying to find his keys in the night. And someone's saying, where did you drop them? He said, over there. And he said, why are you looking here? He said, the light's brighter. And so often what you see in this assessment is people assess what's easy to assess rather than what they need to assess. They look where the light is brighter. They don't actually look where the issues are that matter. So fundamentally, what this does is enable you to defend your judgment. If you're going to fail blogs, then you can say, well, which part of this is now going to be suddenly turned into success? Are you going to suddenly say that he can clarify assessment tools? How can you say that? I mean, the evidence is he can't. So you can't. And administration doesn't come into it. I mean, the administration can't suddenly say, oh, well, we're going to drop the pass mark, which is what they did. They kept dropping the pass mark until enough students passed to move into year 2 or year 4 or whatever it was. So fundamentally, this means you can defend a judgment you've made. But you also might, of course, discover from this that there are some supplementary assessments that could be done so that you might be able to say, well, look, this is where blogs went wrong. Let's see if we can do a little bit of supplementary training and a little bit of supplementary assessment to get blogs over the line. When I say the line, I'm talking about the 100% line here. I'm not talking about the 50% line. I'm talking about 100% line. So that this is also really much better as a diagnostic record. So as a record of student outcomes, it is also brilliant for dealing with appeals and defending the quality of your professional judgment. But it's also good for audits. As auditors, we would love to be able to see this kind of evidence. Notice that it basically enables you to say, I, as an industry-skilled person who loves challenge tests, I have made a safe call And in order to be able to look at this straight away and see that every I has been dotted and every wrong thing has been crossed. So that's good. But then when it comes to litigation, this is really powerful stuff, because this is a record that first you have complied with the standard in terms of what the competency says. That's really good. So straight away it says you know what the standard was. That's good. Second thing, it says you have devised a set of strategies, or you've purchased a set of strategies which cover everything that needs to be seen. Thirdly, I have carried through a set of assessment strategies. Then here are the outcomes. I don't need to keep the samples. This is what I saw. And it wasn't at the time appealed or defended. It was accepted by the student. So this is what I saw. Then I made a judgment on the basis of this, and this is how I made the judgment. So you can see that this bit of paper is your insurance certificate. It protects you from litigation. And I would keep that piece of paper for 7 years. So when we come to that question about confidentiality and so on, this is the piece of paper I would keep. Because that will be enough to defend your judgment. Now this is your record of what you observed. It's not the student's record, it's your record. So you're entitled to have it. After all, it's your decision that you made. It's a bit like a medical practitioner keeping their records on decisions and advice that they're given. You're a professional. When it comes as an assessor, you're a professional. you make professional judgments, and this is basically saying I did it right. And so it is your protection. So it's your protection against litigation. And finally, the assessment validation. Standard 1, again, topic for next time, but standard 1.9 through to 1.11 basically means that you need to be able to validate assessments. And people need to be able to go back through now at what you've done. I might stress that people, when it talks about assessment validation in standard 1.9 through to 1.11, most people don't realise that it also means assessor validation. That's why you can't be one of the validators, because you're being validated yourself. So this record becomes a way of validating you, as well as validating the assessments, the assessment process, the assessment judgments and the like. So it's a tremendous contributor to 1.9 through 1.11 as a way of establishing that you, as the user of the system, is actually working in a valid and quality way. So you can see that these records are really worth keeping, and you can see that there's almost everything you need on this single piece of paper. And if you've got 15 students, you need 15 pieces of paper. And if they've got 15 units, you need 225 pieces of paper. But this could be done electronically. It needn't be actual paper. It can be kept electronically as long as you've got it. So you need to keep some records securely. Firstly, you need to keep the unit of competency, because this changes. So in 7 years' time, they could have gone through 2 or 3 new versions. And so you need to be able to resurrect the unit. Now, it's quite possibly going to be on the training.gov forever, but it might not be. So I would recommend that you keep a copy of the unit. And I would keep that for about 5 to 7 years and be prepared to junk it. I have drawers of stuff and it's got the year on the drawer, and every now and then I empty out the drawer, goes through the shredder, and everything moves up a year. So that's how I can do it. Signed and dated assessment plans and records for all students. So that's these, signed and dated records for all students. And this can have, I don't know if it has it or not, I haven't got it on here, but you could have the student sign it as well, if you wished, as a truthful and accurate record. I haven't got it on here. I've got room for the assessor to sign it. I might say, by the way, that if you're using an assessment team, that is a qualified assessor, along with an industry expert, then they both would have to sign this. And that's what's suggested there. But you could, if you want to, have the students sign that. I don't think it's necessarily, it's certainly not mandated, but it's not a bad idea. Then relevant assessment tools. We need to know what PA1, PA2, PA3 means. We don't need PA1 for every student. We don't need PA2 for every student. We just need an example of what PA1 was, what PA2 was, what PA3 was, what KA was. So I need in my little bundle the unit, the student's records, the actual tools that I used, tools, instruments, or forgot what the other word was, but tests, whatever they were, the 3 or 4 of those. One set per cohort, keep it for 5 to 7 years, and we need to keep completed assessment tools, but only a small sample. Now, this is important because you only need to keep this for the next validation event. You know that every unit is validated once every 5 years, I mean. So you know, while you're building up towards its next validation, you might know that this unit's going to get validated next year. Well, keep a sample of completed assessment, you know, PA1, PA2, PA3. We talk about samples, and we will do next time we meet, but we're not talking about a monstrously huge sample. And so you'll find in the fact sheet that it suggests that you only need to keep a small number of samples that are illustrative of what you have done, of the kind of evidence that you're getting. It might be, as you've suggested, some video evidence, if you've got that. But it might be video, it might be photographic, if you know, stills. But we don't expect you to keep samples of cooked food or samples of yeah, and a lot of things are ephemeral, like, you know, the person drives from A to B. We don't have a record of that unless we've videoed it. But we will have the checklists completed by an observer. So there's some things are real and you can photograph them. Some things are ephemeral, like a conversation, in which case all you can have is a record or a summary or an outline of what happened in that conversation. And indeed, some evidence is confidential. I mean, if you've got a person in an aged care facility, you can't video a person being showered. You only have a checklist which says that the showering was observed and the protocols were properly followed. Any other kind of thing would be not just a breach of confidentiality, but of privacy. So there are going to be some circumstances where you simply cannot retain those kinds of records. But these are not records well, I've lost it now, but these are records of your observations, and they can leave the room. Whereas other records might be confidential and have to be left behind. So we have a situation here where some records need to be kept for a long period of time, but you can actually see that you end up with a small package per group of students, and keep them for about 5 to 7 years. That will cover you in terms of appeals, because if there's an appeal, it will certainly happen in that time span. Audit by an auditor, the RTOs are audited now for about 7 years. So, you know, it was likely that within the next 5 to 7 years you're going to get audited. Here is a body of evidence. Litigation, you could be held accountable at least to some residual extent up to about 5 to 7 years. Tax says 5 years, so, you know, this will give you protection. And so those sorts of documents you need to keep electronically or physically, but certainly securely. And securely if there are electronic means on multiple devices, in case one of them collapses. And it means in current media, not on a floppy disk or on a tape or something else like that. That would be useless. So we have, when it comes to keeping records, some very significantly valuable strategies, but the chief of which is this record of achievement. So you can see now that record starts as a planning tool to establish understanding 1.8 that you've developed valid evidence gathering tools, instruments, or whatever, or tests, and methods and strategies. Secondly, it then becomes a record of a cumulative record of a person's progress through the training, which guides training and guides you as an instructor. You can look across a number of students and say, hey, they're all getting this bit wrong. What do I need to do about my teaching? So you see the tool now becomes a diagnostic device, and then it becomes a device for supplementary training, and supplementary assessment. And then ultimately it becomes a device, and it becomes a device for letting evidence from Mary into the thing so that we can incorporate her extra performance in relation to the competency. It enables us to import evidence from other units if it's relevant, so that we can streamline and be very flexible and very fair in our processes. So you can see how at the end of the day the judgment becomes flexible, fair, valid, because we're using this thing as our tool to make sure it's valid, and reliable because we will keep on getting the same answer. We won't be won't depend on whether we're tired or relaxed or slightly inebriated. We'll be able to make the same reliable judgments. And then it becomes a record. So it's a brilliant little document. And it is, yes, hard to get your head around the first time, but once you start getting into them, you'll find they're dead easy to write. And they give you an enormously good sense of security, which is something that we often lack in this game. Yes?
I just wanted to clarify, is it optional whether the student sees their record and signs it for each assessment that they complete? In other words, should they sign it and you sign it and then it gets scanned and then you can throw it away or whatever and just use the scan?
I would think that would be good practice. It's certainly not mandated in the standards. However, fairness in terms of judgment would suggest that there needs to be what they call a transparent system. I don't really like the word transparent because transparent means you can't see it. It needs to be visible. They need to be able to see what's going on. They need to be participants. In the old days, I don't know if they still do, we used to talk about locus of control. And the locus of control was traditionally in the hands of the trainer and the assessor. But one of the beautiful things about competency-based approaches is the locus of control can move to the individual learner. So they can become much more in charge of their own learning. I remember when we started introducing this into the Department of Ministry of Justice here in Western Australia, and we had Certificate 1, well, actually they weren't Certificate 1, they were Certificate 3, but they were Level 1 staff in the sector who were mostly mature women who had come into the job and were hitting a glass ceiling because they couldn't move forward. Well, they introduced a competency-based assessment process in order for those women to be able to get the competencies that they were demonstrating every day in their ordinary work recognised. I might say that the outcome of that was some didn't want to participate because they felt threatened by it because it is a slightly threatening exercise. Others participated and ended up becoming senior managers because they suddenly grasped their own competencies and took control of their own competencies. And in that sense, their participation in that process was profoundly important. Others went on and did university degrees, and because we negotiated with, I think, Edith Cowan for ability for them to move their Certificate 3 to get credit towards a management degree. And the effect of that was to really dynamize, is that the word? Not dynamite. It really invigorated and stimulated and empowered the individuals, and it was brilliant to see that. But they also became a kind of threat because they became, in some ways, they started demanding training. They started saying, I'm about to do something. I'm going to go in and deal with this complex situation. I want somebody in there watching me so that I can get recognition for what they've done. They began to push their supervisors. And we realised then that if we weren't offering the same kind of service for the supervisors, we were going to run into trouble because the supervisors were suddenly being pushed by their junior staff and who were becoming more competent than them. So you started realising that if you introduce this sort of notion of empowerment through competency-based training and assessment, it's got to be across the strata, not just one cell. The cell was the primary focus because they were the disadvantaged group. And they ceased to be the disadvantaged group once that was introduced. And it was wonderful to see the empowerment that introduced. So having the students see what's going on right from the start, you know, and we talk about having an assessment plan which you negotiate and agree with on the student. That isn't written into the standards, but it is a facet of fairness. In the sense that fairness means that I'm going to tell you how I'm going to assess you, what I'm going to assess, when I'm going to assess, and I'm going to tell you about other forms of evidence that I might accept And if you as a student can look at the unit of competency and say, I don't have that evidence here, but I've got it over here, can I bring that in? Then that becomes part of the fairness thing, but you can see it's also part of the empowerment. Then, of course, a student can be empowered to do their own remediation. They can cheat by preparing for assessments, assessment tools or instruments, depending, but they can cheat by preparing for them because I use the word cheat cynically, I might say, because what they're really doing is saying, I know what I have to do to be able to drive this vessel or to drive this truck or whatever. I know what I have to be able to do, so I will develop my skills until I can. And that is not cheating, that is learning. And then they can then validate or at least come to terms with the assessment that's happened by signing the completed form, and that gives you as an assessor. But we can also ask them, and this is going to come up next time we meet, we can also ask them to comment on this being what it was like being assessed, because we might learn from them about better ways to assess. We might learn from them about some of the distractions or confusions that the assessment process has introduced. No assessment tool or instrument is going to be all that clean, because it's all, I mean, it's a bit like this business about referencing. Almost, you know, if the person has to write a report, it brings into it issues of literacy and sentence construction and paragraphing and so on that might go beyond the unit. So it's almost impossible to design an assessment process that is purely clinically defined by the unit. So we need to know where these spurious forces are acting on our observations. So asking the students to participate in that feedback is good. So we have a whole range of reasons to engage the student like that. So it is really encouraged, but it's not mandated, except for the word fairness. But it's not mandated. We really like to see that going on there. And it represents a kind of faith and confidence in yourself, that this is not something you do to them in a kind of secretive way, but it's something that you share with them. And that's what's missing from higher education and from schooling. I mean, the year 12 teachers have no idea if they've prepared their students properly for the outcomes, because they have no idea what the standards will be like in terms of the final assessments. But the final assessors have no idea what the standards will be until they get the students' work done. And then the statisticians will determine what the marks are. In other words, they are operating in a completely standardless environment, but we're not. And because we operate in an environment where there are real standards, sometimes poorly written, but nonetheless real standards, we can have this transparent system where learning is a corroborative thing and a collaborative thing and an empowering thing, rather than you being just taught to, you learn with. So we've got a very different game, and our records can serve that function well. So don't think of the records as some sort of dry, boring process. It provides a form of student engagement. It provides a basis for thinking and planning. It provides a basis for credibility and protection. So records can be a very valuable contributor to our work as trainers and assessors. There was one more little dot point, and it almost fell off the bottom. If you're using RPL processes, keep records of those. Now, if you're using RPL processes, they should be mappable onto the same document. But PA1, PA2, PA3, and so on might be slightly different. You might have gathered evidence from a range of other sources. So you would have to make sure that if it was a record of evidence for RPL, that it was that you represented the instruments or the tools or the sources of evidence appropriately in your mapping. But at the end of the day, with RPL, precisely the same criteria need to be demonstrated with precisely the same rigor and credibility. RPL is not a shortcut assessment process. It only shortcuts the training process, but it does not shortcut the assessment process. And under those circumstances, you need to keep a record. And again, as auditors, if you are offering RPL, we like to see what's been done and that would be we need to see the processes, and we maybe need to see the evidence itself within the context of validation. Any comments, questions? Well, I think we're done. The next assessment workshop is part 3B, or part 4, depending on which way you like to look at it. Again, it's called Assessment in Practice, and we're going to look at assessment appeals, and that's looking at Standard 6, and we're going to be looking at the validation of assessment practices and outcomes, and that looks in part at Standard 1.8, which is validation prior during the development phase, or if you've purchased an assessment tool, it involves validation of the tool before you use it. Then there's validation that happens whilst you're actually conducting the assessment process, and how you monitor and make sure that that things are operating effectively. Then there's validation of the outcomes, whether the judgments you made truly do reflect that work readiness that you promise. It may be that what turns out is that the blooming standards are invalid, but you need to know, if it's not working, where the invalidity lies. It might be in your tools, it might be in yourself, it might be in the standards, it might even be in the understanding of industry of what's going on. I remember we had an RTO, we had a complaint. TAC was lodged a complaint. I don't think I'm telling stories out of school here because I won't mention names, against an RTO that was delivering a certificate one in hospitality, and they complained bitterly that one of the graduates from this RTO had been put in charge of the restaurant while the owners went on holidays, and when they came back they found chaos, and therefore the training was clearly unacceptable. But this was a certificate one, and we had to explain to the owners of the restaurant that a certificate one can only operate under direct instruction of a qualified tradesperson, in the case of chef, could not be left in charge of the restaurant. And the problem there was that the invalidity was in their interpretation of the standard. So the invalidity lay not with the RTO, not with the assessment process, not with anything other than industry, in this case the owners of the restaurant, not understanding what certificate one meant. We then suggested to the RTO that they always include on the back of the certificate what it means. Because clearly they were in danger of having a lot of people misunderstanding it. So we look at validation of assessment practices and assessment outcomes. So it'd be nice to see you again in November the 6th or November the 7th, and those of you online, it'd be nice to catch up with you again then. If you've got any questions, now is a good time to ask, and then we shall break for the day. Do we have any questions? You comfortable with all of that? If you would like anything more on, if anyone would like anything more on mapping and so on, there's the assessment fact sheet, which does provide some advice. If you send me an email, I can get you some stuff. Now, I was given a brand new set of pens today, so here I'm going to use it. I'm going to write my email address, and then oh yes, can I collect those too? Thank you. So my email address is docking so that's a 2, not a Z, at bigpond.com. Docking to a jetty would be good. At Big Pond, there's no dot at the end there. I've better be careful about that. Now, I'm happy to take any emails from you if you want to ask a short question. When it comes to emails, I'm good at short questions, and you'll get short answers. If you've got long questions, that might be another issue. But I'm certainly happy to take short questions from you, both those of you online and those of you here today, present today. Can I say thank you very much to everybody who's participated online. It's really nice that you've been with us, if not in person, certainly in spirit. And as this invitation, of course, goes to you as well. Also keep in mind that you can go back to previous workshops, and that this workshop has been recorded. Maybe it's going to be tomorrow's, or it might be today's, depending on which one worked best. But one of these will be recorded and available to you on the TAC website. So you might be famous. At least the back of your head might be.
Do you want to collect activity 1?
Oh, yes. Can I please collect up activity 1s, please? Thank you very much. All activity 1s, thank you. Here's one. Here's one. No, no. There it is. Okay. Thank you. Now you're free to go. Activity 1s. Thank you.